Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's I'm greatly I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Ismaili Studies to this, our first conference on the Fatimids. We were hoping to hold this in our beautiful building at the Aachen Center, but unfortunately, due to the continuation of the pandemic conditions, we had to do it online. Anyway, I trust and hope that you are all well and keeping safe. I'll just say a few words on some of the features of the Fatimids. The Fatimids, as you know, had a dual characteristic. They were imams and also caliphs. They were imams of the Ismailis and caliphs ruling over a state which very soon grew into a major empire. And this conference, from what I've seen, will look at aspects of both of these domains. The foundation of the Fatimid state in the year 909 indeed marked the culmination of the success of the Fatimid, of the Ismaili da'wah. The da'wah had led to the creation of a dawla, and this really marked a great success, not only for the Ismailis, but also for the Shia at large, because now for the first time, the Ismailis had a state of their own within which they could practice their faith, not fearing, persecution. And as the Fatimids continue to hold on to the universal, aspirations, they did not disband their da'wah organization, and in fact, the da'wah organization achieved its peak under the Fatimids, but oddly, the da'wah found its greatest and most lasting success outside of the Fatimid dominions, where the Ismailis were actually persecuted. This was mainly because in those regions, the inhabitants of those regions were more familiar with various Shiite traditions. It was also under the Fatimids that Ismaili law was actually codified, and the Ismailis came to have their own school of jurisprudence, like the various Sunni schools and the school adhered to by the Ithna Asharis or 12ers. Now, as the caliphs, the Fatimids ruled over the state, they also patronized arts and architecture and sciences and the variety of other literary and intellectual activities. And in fact, the city of Cairo, founded in 969 by the Fatimids themselves, rivaled Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasids, as a center of learning. The Fatimid state, or the Fatimid Caliphate, enjoyed a flourishing trade and commerce, not only with Europe, but also with India, and so on and so forth. And finally, another distinctive feature of the Fatimids, which had great impact on the history of this dynasty, was the openness of the Fatimids towards other religions and ethnicities. And it was in that light that the Fatimids did appoint a number of non-Ismailis, Sunni Muslims, Christians, both Copts and Armenians, and also Jews, to a variety of high offices in the states. And this really, of course, contributed to the resilience of the state. But the same factor eventually served to create sectarianism and factional fighting within the Fatimid. So the Fatimid armies, which contributed to the downfall and the eventual demise of the Fatimid Caliphate. It remains for me to thank Gregory, Bilotto, and Shainul Jiva, who have spent months and months organizing this conference very meticulously, and I do look forward to hearing the presentations that will occur over the next 4 days. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Gregory Bilotto, and I hope you'll find this event extremely beneficial, given the theme, Fatimid Cosmopolitanism, particularly relevant in the global world of today. I would now like to introduce Professor Stéphane Pradines of Aga Khan University, London, who will deliver the first presentation. Dr. Pradines has completed several excavations on the Fatimid sites throughout Cairo, graciously funded by His Highness the Aga Khan. He has undertaken numerous excavations in East Africa, the Maldives, and Pakistan, and he is the founding editor of the Journal of Material Cultures in the Muslim World in partnership with Brill and the Aga Khan University. Professor Pradines, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Greg. First, I would like to thank all my colleagues from the Institute of Ismaili Studies for their kind invitation, their support, and of course, their deep interest in my research. In particular, I think about, of course, at Dr. Daftary, Dr. Jiva, Dr. Bilotto, and Dr. Harris, and all the colleagues who contacted me to organize this paper. I think I will try to share my screen with you now. And please tell me if you can see a full screen. Is it okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. I realize that time flies very quickly. And in 1998, I was a PhD student doing my research under the direction of Marianne Barucan, when she organized a conference on Fatimid art. And here we are, more than 20 years later, we have this new conference on Fatimid art, you know, but on a more cosmopolitan and a global perspective. So it's also a good opportunity to see what we have learned from and what are the new results, the new trend in the research about Fatimid art, architecture, and of course, archaeology. I will speak today about this particular field, Fatimid archaeology. It seems to be a bit provocative, but in fact, it is just a realistic statement. Most of what we know about Fatimid material culture, in fact, comes from Fusṭāṭ and not from Al-Qaira. Therefore, my presentation will be divided in 2 parts: all previous knowledge about Fatimid Fusṭāṭ and all new discoveries in Fatimid Al-Qaira. During the Fatimid period in Egypt, from 969 to 1171, Fusṭāṭ, the first Islamic capital city of the country, remained the economic engine and hub of the Fatimid Caliphate. It is an established fact, and all the specialists of Cairo urban history knew that. Fusṭāṭ was the city of the people, whereas Al-Qaira was the city of the Fatimid Caliphal family, princes, nobles, and the army. Even after the fire destruction of Fusṭāṭ in 1168, people remained in the city that was protected by a new Ayyubid city wall in the late 12th and early 13th century. It was only during the early Mamluk period that the people left Fusṭāṭ. It seems that some Fatimid specialists underestimated the role of Fusṭāṭ in the building of our knowledge on Fatimid material culture. First question, why is Fusṭāṭ so important for us? What makes Fusṭāṭ so special? Of course, for the historian, the response is very simple. The place was described by many primary sources, and it was a topic of many researchers, book, PhD, etc. For archaeologists, the response is also very easy. Fusṭāṭ, as you can see on this map, was a no man's land. an empty space full of debris and objects, which were easy to collect by amateurs and archaeologists. After the plague epidemic and the economic crisis during the Mamluk period, mid-14th century, Fusṭāṭ was definitively abandoned to the profit of areas between the mosque of Ibn Tulun and Bab Zuela, but also the banks of the river Nile, especially the area of Bulak. This colonization was facilitated by the great city wall built by the Ayyubids to the east and by the move of the Nile riverbed shifting slowly to the west, exposing new wetlands and marsh areas easy to urbanize on the eastern banks. Fusṭāṭ, located to the south, was far from everything. The economic, religious, and political life of the Mamluks was now to the north, at the footsteps of the citadel. Fusṭāṭ was abandoned, and it became a pile of ruins, hills of debris, or Qom in Egyptian. In the 19th century, with the arrival of European travelers during the Muhammad Ali period, and later during the British Protectorate, it was common to go to Fusṭāṭ to collect some pieces of pottery and other objects. Many artifacts followed this route into the collections of national European museums, just as to mention some of them, the Louvre, the V&A, and the Ashmolean Museum, for example. Later, scientific archaeological excavations were organized in Fusṭāṭ by Albert Gabriel and Ali Bagat in the early 20th century. Then the ruins of Fusṭāṭ were investigated by archaeologists such as George Canlon in the 60s up to the 80s, Mutsuo Kawatoko from 1978 to 1985, and Roland-Pierre Guéraud in Istablantar from the mid-80s to 2003. Most of the archaeological discoveries were done by Albert Gabriel and Ali Bagat, but also Roland-Pierre Guéraud. George Canlon, the architectural discoveries, sorry. George Canlon and Mutsuo Kawatoko publications and reports were more around the material culture, ceramics, glass, coins, craft, and objects. Because Fusṭāṭ was abandoned during the early Mamluk period, most of the architectural remained untouched and preserved. They were not destroyed by the Mamluk and Ottoman housing or modern urbanization. Fusṭāṭ was not reoccupied, and because the area was a vast no man's land, it was easy for archaeologists to open digs and to do excavations. It was what I can call a nice and easy playground. The first Arab city and the Umayyad levels have left few imprints under 2 centuries of Fatimid occupation layers. Most of the buildings excavated are in fact from the Fatimid and late Fatimid period. You need to go to the Istablantar plateau to have a proper vision of the Arab conquest, the Rashidun, or the Umayyad occupation levels, and the buildings excavated by Roland-Pierre Guéraud. Contrary to what is commonly thought, the Mamluk occupation of Fusṭāṭ was not so important, and the site was already at the periphery of the city. Most of the Mamluk activities that took place in Fusṭāṭ were craft and so-called polluting activities, potters, and so on. Activities that people didn't want around their living areas. It is why we usually read in the publications the statement produced in the workshops of Fusṭāṭ. And sometimes it is true, and it is well documented by historical sources. I'm thinking just, for example, according to my colleague, Professor Anna Contandini, with the Fatimid rock crystal, for example. And later for the Mamluk potteries workshops studied by Professor Scanlon. But the history of urbanized area and the dwellings is different. People left Fusṭāṭ during the 13th century. And then in 1348, the plague epidemic was the final blow to the occupation and the activities in the area. Another problem concerns the nature of the objects collected in Fusṭāṭ. Most of the artifacts that we have in our museums did not come from scientific excavations. They came from amateur survey and weekend collectors walking on the mounts of Fusṭāṭ. Eyewitnesses myself, many people doing this on the combs of the hills of Barkia and Darasa before the Al-Azhar Park construction. What people collected and even collect even today are nice and shiny objects with nice glaze, decoration, calligraphy, most of the time complete objects such as oil lamps. It is a reason why we have an over-representation of Mamluk graffiato bases with the Mamluk rank or blazon, the Fatimid lustrous wares, small objects such as molar flask, oil lamps, etc. Do we have a good vision of Fatimid material culture through these selective and qualitative collections? The response is, of course, no. Finally, we have a last problem in the Fatimid archaeology historiography. It is the weight of Al-Qaira and Fusṭāṭ compared to the other Fatimid settlements in Egypt, Bilad al-Sham, and North Africa. The Fatimid material culture that we know is mainly from the capital city. This is something that all the specialists of Egyptian Islamic architecture know very well. The other cities and settlements are most of the time ignored or understudied. Just to mention some of them, Luxor, Kos, the cities of the Delta, including Tunis, we don't have a lot of good and serious evidence about Fatimid settlements and material culture in these areas. Fortunately, some places have been investigated more carefully, such as Alexandria by the teams of Jean-Yves Ventreur, Aswan by the Swiss team, and I know that Gregory will later talk about the result of these investigations, and of course Israel, where many excellent excavations were conducted on Fatimid settlements or occupation levels. Nevertheless, we should keep in mind that we don't have a good regional vision of Fatimid art and architecture. To the opposite of Fusṭāṭ, the situation was different in Fatimid Cairo, the heart of what we call today Islamic Cairo. If Salah ad-Din destroyed the Fatimid palaces, most of the Fatimid city was reused, including houses, mosques, and the streets. Then with time, the Fatimid city disappeared under the Mamluk constructions, the Ottoman buildings, and finally, the modernization of the 19th century under the Khedive Ismail and his successors until President Mubarak. Fatimid Cairo was the heart of what is called today Islamic Cairo, and it's still inhabited and an important living area between Gamaliya and Darb al-Ahmar. With the souk, the Khan al-Khalili, the place is an economic hub with many shops, artisans, from jewelry shops in Al-Muiz Street to the tent makers of al-Hamayya. Despite the poverty, this is an area densely occupied with many families, schools, hospitals. It is a reason why it was very difficult to do excavations in Fatimid Cairo. Plus, it is almost impossible to do rescue or salvage excavations in the city, as the corruption is so important that the property developers don't give you the space and time to do excavations. It is one of the main reasons why I was forced to stop my excavations in 2016. Nowadays, only the monumental gate and the Fatimid mosque are visible, last witnesses of the Fatimid prestigious past. Despite the quality of the documentation provided by Al-Makrizi and so well published, for example, by my colleague, my dear colleague, Professor Ayman Fouad Said, what we knew of the limits and the street of the Fatimid city was not proved by material evidence. If Fusṭāṭ was well known by the archaeologists, Fatimid Cairo was almost a terra incognita. Only small test pits and limited excavations were conducted in the Fatimid city. Most of the time, these excavations were linked to conservation projects of Ottoman or Mamluk monuments, such as the Fatimid fountains and bassins found by Bernard Maury, and later, some of them were found also in the complex of the Mamluk complex of Al-Nasir Mohammed by Philip Spicer and Giorgio Noguera. In 1998, the Aga Khan decided to create a huge panoramic park in the heart of Islamic Cairo. During the earthwork, an important part of the Ayyubid wall was uncovered by the bulldozers during the landscaping phase of the Al-Azhar Park, one of the most iconic projects of the Aga Khan in Egypt. The foundation immediately set up a conservation project to restore the monument. Here you can see also the restoration of the houses and the living area. Our project started in 1999 when I was sent to Cairo by my late professor, Marianne Barucan, to work with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture on the wall of Salah ad-Din. A scientific cooperation was established in 2000 between the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, the French Institute of Archaeology, IFAO, and the Ministry of Egyptian Antiquity, but also the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Here you can see all the partners and also the branch concerned, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, and here all the partners that I mentioned previously. At first, we did some test pits on the Ayyubid wall, and then in 2000, and then in 2001, the Aga Khan gave us a huge site, intramuros, the archaeological triangle or parking darasa, where we worked from 2001 to 2009. On this site, we discovered a first level of occupation with a small Fatimid garden and a fountain from the end of the 10th century. Most probably a Fatimid mausoleum built outside the city around 980-1000 if we compare to those excavated by Roland Guéraud in Istablantar. Then we exhumed the Fatimid mud brick wall built by Badr al-Jamali between 1087 and 1091, built directly over the mausoleum and showing an extension of the town to the east. You can see here the mausoleum and the fountain here, and here some Fatimid previous occupations cut by the foundations. The Fatimid mud brick wall was reused and finally covered up by Mamluk dwellings and occupation layers. The wall was still visible during the Mamluk period, and therefore the area is mentioned by Al-Makrizi as Bain el-Surayn, the area between the walls, between the Ayyubid wall that you can see to the left and the Fatimid wall that you can see to the right. Here it is, but maybe more clear. In gray, dark gray, the Ayyubid wall from the end of the 12th century, and the previous Fatimid wall made of mud brick from the end of the 11th century, and the area Bain el-Surayn between the walls here. Later, I extended the project to the entire eastern walls of Cairo with the excavations of the Fatimid gate of Bab el-Tawfiq in 2004 and 2005. So on the other side of the Al-Azhar Street, you can see the location here. It was an extremely useful excavation that showed the connection of the Fatimid mud brick wall with a limestone gate built by Badr al-Jamali between 1087 and 1091, with a beautiful inscription still in situ on the top of the gate in Kufik. The gate was protected by 2 square mud brick towers and also a glacis, a zalaka, like the one who was demolished by an Ayyubid Sultan in front of Bab Zuela. From 2007 to 2016, we opened a new excavation site in the northeast corner of the Fatimid city, in the area between Bourg al-Zafar and Bab al-Jadid. We exhumed more than 50 meters of the Fatimid mud brick wall built by Badr al-Jamali. It was very clear that Saladin built his new town wall just in front of the previous Fatimid one. Fatimid, and here you have the Ayyubid wall. Salah ad-Din Vizier and later Sultan strictly followed the limits of the Fatimid city. Later, he extended his wall up to the footsteps of the citadel. To the northern front, we discovered an older wall, the first Fatimid rammed earth fortifications made by Jawhar al-Sikili between 969 and 971. Here you can see just the wall of Badr al-Jamali that I mentioned previously and the wall of Salah ad-Din. And on this slide, you can see in green the bit of the wall that we found, the first Fatimid wall of the city built by Jawhar al-Sikili. You can see this wall here. The technology is also different because it's not a wall made of mud brick, but a wall made of pisé, rammed earth. We work also on the walls built by Salah ad-Din when he was wazir of the last Fatimid Caliph al-Adid from 1169 to 1171. The corner towers of Burj al-Zafar and Burj al-Maruk, or Burj al-Maruk, are two excellent example of this period ignored by the specialists, the vizirate of Salah ad-Din and the last Fatimid constructions. Finally, we work on the northern wall beside the monumental gate of Bab al-Nasr from 2012 to 2014 and on the site of Al-Mashtal in 2016. The site was located between Burj al-Zafar and Bab al-Nasr. Here you can see the site of Bab al-Nasr, behind Bab al-Nasr. Here, located here. On these two sites, we were able to confirm the pattern and the date of the two Fatimid walls. The one of Jawhar, made of rammed earth or pisé, tabia, and the second one built by Badr al-Jamali, built with mud bricks, toblaban. We were also able to explain why the Fatimid wall was turning to the south in the southeast corner of Bab al-Nasr. You see this part here of the wall that you can see today. In fact, Badr al-Jamali connected the new wall to the old and first Fatimid gate of Bab al-Nasr, built by the General Gawar. Here you have the first Fatimid gate built by the General Gawar, or Jawhar. One regular pattern appears. Whatever the building material the Fatimids use for the walls, rammed earth or mud bricks for the second period, they always use limestone for the gates to give a monumental and ceremonial aspect to the main entrances of the city. Here you can see one of the twin towers of the first Fatimid gate of Bab al-Nasr, a semicircular tower. The other one was destroyed by the refortification of Badr al-Jamali. So this is a part of the wall of Badr al-Jamali connected to the back of the first wall of the city by Jawhar al-Sikili. Here you have the first period, Gawar or Jawhar, and here's the second period with the refortifications of Badr al-Jamali. Here you have the last site that we excavated, Al-Mashtal in 2016, where you can see the wall of Salah ad-Din from the end of the 12th century. And here you have the two Fatimid walls. You have the first wall made of tabia, the wall of Jawhar al-Sikili, and later Badr al-Jamali built another wall made of mud brick, this one. From 2000 to 2016, our project was the first large-scale archaeological excavations in open area done in Fatimid Cairo. As you can see here with this area occupied by Zabalin, it was a difficult challenge because we have to work in very poor areas, most of the time full of rubbish and debris, and it took us from time to time. I had like 2 months of excavations, and we took like 1 month just to clear the debris before starting the excavations. For 17 years, we collected a huge quantity of artifacts. Here you can see the result. You know, I like photos before and after. So after, here you have the archaeological park of the archaeological triangle near the Al-Azhar Park, where you can see the Ayyubid wall, the Fatimid wall, and we let a little bit of the Mamluk settlement. So the visitors, they can have an idea about the stratigraphy and the different period excavated, you know, in Islamic Cairo. Here you have the Mamluk settlement. For 17 years, we collected a huge quantity of artifacts, not only Fatimids, but also Ayyubid, Mamluk, and Ottoman. We were able to uncover archaeological levels, architectures, and stratigraphy that provided a historical context to Fatimid objects such as ceramics, metalwork, ivory, bone, wood, and glass. For example, our ceramologist, Julie Monchamp, published a book that can be considered as the best catalog ever produced on Fatimid ceramics in archaeological context, so with a very good chronology. And also the common wares, let's say the regular production for the people, not only like you see here with this lustrous ware, not only the production for rich people, but also the normal ceramic for normal people during the Fatimid period who were completely ignored in the survey done, for example, in Fusṭāṭ by amateurs. Our archaeological mission rewrites the history of Cairo through the study of the medieval fortification. Through our research, it is now possible to provide new information, not only on the Fatimid walls, but most importantly, to propose a new vision of the Fatimid city, its perimeter, superficies, main gates, main street, and urbanization. You can see, in fact, from our results, that the first Fatimid wall from Jawhar was much bigger than what we previously thought. And Salah ad-Din, in fact, at least for the eastern part, it just followed the second Fatimid wall built by Badr al-Jamali. Okay, this is the street patterns from the map of description of Egypt. I am now working with the French Institute on the publications of 2 volumes on the Fatimid and Ayyubid fortifications. And with the IIS, in a partnership with the Aga Khan University, we are working on the Fatimid City 3D project, a project of virtual reconstruction of Fatimid Cairo based on architectural, archaeological, topographical, and textual evidence. Our 3D model will give a new life to the Fatimid city, and it will give to the general public access to our archaeological discoveries. In 2007, with Professor Osama Talat, now Director of Islamic Antiquities, we opened the first field school of Islamic archaeology in Egypt, and probably the biggest one in the Middle East. Up to 2016, we trained more than 100 Egyptian scholars from Cairo University, Ain Shams University, Fayoum University, and also from the Ministry of Antiquities. It was an important part of our mission, and I am extremely proud of the results and the success of this field school. Some of our students are now very important scholars, just to mention Dr. Ahmed al-Shawki, former director of the Islamic Art Museum in Cairo. I would like to thank here all the teams that work with me all these years, the permanent members of the mission, my colleagues from the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, from the Egyptian Antiquities, as well as the hundreds of volunteers, students, and workers who devoted so much energy to this project. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Pradines. That was a very, very helpful and a very visually attractive way of walking us through 17 years of very hard work and tremendous findings that you've now made available with your team. We have maybe 3-4 minutes if any of the panelists have any questions. Oli, I see Oli, Dr. Ockerman, I see your hand. Do you just want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, hi, Stéphane. Greetings from Holland. Thank you for this wonderful keynote, lovely start of the conference. My question goes into the direction of, surprise, surprise, libraries, archives, documents. Of course, you mentioned the artifacts that were found during these digs, and I wanted to ask, have you also found anything sort of written, anything related to the written word during your excavations? And of course, what we've seen now mostly were the city walls, right? And also streets. But do we know anything, from your field from this perspective about, the famous Fatimid institutions of learning, libraries, state archives, these kind of institutions. Thank you.
Hello, Oli. Yes, okay, about the archives and library, of course not, because in fact, what I mentioned that we were able to do these large-scale excavations in open area because we were on the outskirts, on the periphery of the Fatimid city. So even if I mention, the pressure, of the developers or even the corruption, because we were outside the city on the periphery, and because also at the beginning we started up to 2009 with the support of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and the Al-Azhar Park, we were in a kind protected. So it was possible to work peacefully on the edge, of the Fatimid city, but we don't have information about the inside, of the Fatimid city. So if you mention the library, I'm thinking, of course, about the Fatimid Palace. I remember a few years ago, I was with the former director of the Arab Studies at the IFAO, Sylvie Denoy, and we saw, a building construction right on the Fatimid Palace. They built a small kind of khan, and we asked to the previous director of the Islamic Antiquities, do you plan to do rescue excavations? And they said no. And so from time to time, we have windows, to do excavations in Fatimid Cairo, but people are not really interested to block, huge construction projects to do some rescue or salvage excavations. And of course, it's a shame because it's the only way to have some information, about the Fatimid palaces, library, and so on. To come back to your second question about writing documents, of course, you saw a Fatimid dinar. We found a lot of coins. So far, we work with numismats. We found only one piece of manuscript paper of Mamluk from the Mamluk period. We have a bit of epigraphy, some inscriptions on limestones. We have inscriptions on ceramics. You saw some of them on the lustradware, Fatimid lustradware. We have few pieces, but we don't have a lot of information about the inside, in the middle of the Fatimid city, unfortunately.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent start to the conference. We will now move on to our first panel, and over to you, Dr. Hamdani.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to all of you who are here with us today for the first panel of this conference, which is an honor and a privilege for me to participate in. We've got an impressive lineup of towering figures, many of whom were my teachers or whose seminal scholarship paved the way for my own, and also bright lights. Presenting new and important research on this important period and caliphate in Islamic history. Our panel today is going to explore the way in which the Fatimid experience was constructed and used by contemporary and later historians of Islam. Our speakers are, in order, Dr. Mathew Barber, who received his doctorate from the University of Edinburgh and has written on the Vizierate of Al-Yazuri. Next will be Dr. Fawzia Bora, who received her doctorate from Oxford and is associate professor at Leeds and chair of the British Association of Islamic Studies. And she's written on writing history in the medieval Islamic period. Dr. Shainul Jiwa will be next. She's a senior researcher at the Institute of Ismaili Studies and author of many important studies and editions on the Fatimids or on Fatimid history. And we will be followed then by Dr. Yaakov Lev, who's emeritus professor of Islamic history at Bar Ilan University, again, author of many important works on the Fatimid period, and most recently, a work on Islamic judicial administration in Egypt. You can find fuller biographies and about our presenters and their abstracts in your conference program. Each of our panelists will have 20 minutes to present, followed by a 20-minute question and answer period. Please submit your questions in the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try my best to get to all of the questions that I can in that 20-minute period. Otherwise, please have your microphones and cameras off. Also, we've gotten a request from the Institute that panelists please keep their videos on, because there are some hearing disabled individuals in our audience who need to lip read you, so please don't turn off your cameras. So without further ado then, Dr. Mathew Barber.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now. So thank you firstly to the organizers for allowing me to speak at this conference. The program is really incredible and I'm looking forward to the next few days. And I'm going to talk to you about historiography and how the texts that we use for studying Fatimid history survive today. And I think it's quite nice that this intersects with some of the notes that Professor Pradines was making in his keynote talks. That's nice. So it goes without saying that texts, particularly histories from late medieval Egypt, are of pivotal importance to modern historians of the Fatimids, such as ourselves, especially when we're studying Egyptian periods of their rules. If one glances at the footnotes of any study of the Fatimids, one will find references to a range of late medieval authors, chief among them authors like Ibn Muyassar, al-Nawiri, al-Kalkashandi, and al-Makrizi. However, none of these authors were interested in the Fatimid period alone. They threaded this history into their texts in various ways, which depended on the organization of those texts and potentially even the worldviews of their authors. In this paper, I will propose a potential route for exploring how an author arranges and recontextualizes Fatimid material, which can then be used as a guide to reading and critiquing that content, and I will use the Fatimid fitna as a case study here. I will further propose that this approach can tell us something about how an individual author or work approaches the historical material. This approach will use a combination of close reading and digital analysis, and I'll take as my primary example al-Makrizi's Fusṭāṭ, a topographical history of Egypt covering mostly Cairo and Fusṭāṭ. But I'll also make reference to some other late medieval texts. I chose this text precisely because its arrangement forces al-Makrizi to return to certain periods and turning points in Egyptian history multiple times in the same work and compare between different periods of Egyptian history. Firstly, although it's probably familiar to many of you, I'd like to just give a brief narrative of the Fatimid fitna as context, what al-Makrizi often terms as Shidda, the misery. According to most narratives, in the year 454, fighting broke out between the Black and Turkish factions of the Fatimid army. This problem was then exacerbated by the fact that the state itself was in a very weak position, witnessing frequent changes to the holders of office of vizier and chief qadi in this period. The fighting grew until the civil war enveloped pretty much the entire of Egypt, leaving farmland untended, and inevitably famine and epidemic followed. The treasuries of the Fatimid palace were sold off to pay for the army loyal to the regime, and Egypt was in a really quite a sorry state. In the end, the Caliph al-Mustansir invited the Syrian general Badr al-Jamali to come to his aid, who arrived in 466, put down the rebelling factions, and restored order. I'm going to approach the study of the historiography in three parts. First, I'll examine different types of history writing and their motivations, and look closely at al-Makrizi's Fusṭāṭ in this context. Second, I will move to the framing of dynasties in Mamluk era texts, and third, I will look at some examples of how narratives of the fitna or shidda are reshaped in the Fusṭāṭ depending on the context. There are many types of historical writing from late medieval or the Mamluk period, and all of them are employed in the study of the Fatimids. There are those which I would consider to have quite fixed arrangements, and by this I mean the arrangement is broadly shared across works written by different authors, and the form is quite restricting to the author. So you have chronicles that are organized year by year or month by month, and biographical dictionaries which list people, often organized alphabetically. Of course, there are other schemes, but alphabetically is the most common in the periods that I'm looking at least. In these structures, comparison across historical periods is more difficult for the author because they're quite limited by the formats. Then there are those arrangements which I would consider to be more flexible, that allow authors to move material around and even compare across periods. And I've listed three important examples that I'll return to in this paper, al-Nawiri's Yaḥyā, al-Kalkashandi's Sub, and al-Makrizi's Fusṭāṭ. In the case of the Fusṭāṭ, it would appear that al-Makrizi's selection and framing of material was partially shaped by a concern for forgetting and loss and the role of crises in this process. In al-Makrizi's schema, the Fatimid fitna or shidda takes a primary role. After his introduction to the work, one finds a section that's titled simply Fasl. In this short section, al-Makrizi outlines the works of Khatat that predated his own. He, however, justifies each of them in the context of crisis and forgetting. The main works and events are outlined in the order in which they appear in that section on my slide. First, al-Makrizi notes al-Kindi and al-Qudai, two Fatimid authors of Khatat. These two authors, al-Makrizi argues, preserve the memory of Egypt that existed prior to its destruction during the Fatimid fitna, which he terms as Shidda. This prompts al-Makrizi to provide a lengthy description of the fitna and Badr al-Jamali's restoration of order. He then moves forward to Ibn Barakat, who al-Makrizi claims preserved the knowledge of properties that had been illegally seized, then to al-Juwani, and the last of the authors of Fatimid of Khatat, who preserved memory of landmarks that al-Makrizi claims by that time had already been lost. Al-Makrizi then jumps forward enormously in time to a Khatat of the early 7th, 14th century that preserved information on places that had been lost in the epidemics and famine of the middle of that century. Al-Makrizi then jumps back in time to Ibn Abdul Zahir, whose work of Khatat he praises before mentioning the same epidemics and famine one more time. He concludes with the events and tribulations, that's al-Hawadith wal-Mihan, of 806, a crisis of al-Makrizi's own time, which he experienced and witnessed, and which al-Makrizi is clearly seeing as a justification for the writing of his own work. There are two things to note here. Firstly, in this historical schema, more than 2/3 focuses on the Fatimid period and the vast majority in the Fatimid fitna. I've given some word counts on the slide here, and the green portion is odd sections that concentrate on the fitna, on the Fatimid period. Secondly, al-Makrizi clearly sees crisis and loss as a major driving factor for writing a work of Khatat, carefully associating each work with some destructive event or another. And you can see that some of these are quite major events and others are quite small ones as well. He's just trying to slot it into some kind of schema. I think this organization in part is motivated by the fact that al-Makrizi is profoundly affected by a crisis which he terms throughout his work. So we find this in his Suluk as well, al-Hawadith wal-Mihan. This appears to be a series of serious events that occurred in and after 806 that led to widespread destruction and loss, in which al-Makrizi gives significant emphasis to the devaluation of copper fulus that happened in 807. It should be noted that al-Makrizi gives much more significance to these events than other contemporaries and near contemporaries, at least from what I can see in the chronicles. In the example that I just gave, al-Makrizi directly compares two periods of Egyptian history in one section, Fatimid and Mamluk, clearly demarcating that periodization by mentioning dates. Al-Makrizi frequently uses dates to navigate through different periods in the section of his Khatat. It's therefore possible to use these date mentions to understand what periods are most discussed in a Khatat and how periodized material is framed. And I've approached this question digitally. So using a Python script, I automatically converted all of the year mentions in al-Makrizi's Khatat into numerical dates. I then categorized these dates by periods of Egyptian history and counted their frequencies. Using this, it's possible to map the mentions of different periods of Egyptian history on a graph and see which dynasties are mentioned where in the Khatats, or which dynastic eras are mentioned based on the dates. Before I move on, a first point to note is the issue of first century dates. As I'm sure many of you are aware, years in Arabic texts are quite frequently mentioned without the century, as it's obvious from the context to which century that date belongs. Because of this, a date identified as 64 history, as in the example on my slide, might in fact be 464 history. For this reason, in the following graphs, I've not given a dynastic designation to any first century dates, but separated them out. We'd have to judge them on a case-by-case basis. The graph on this slide shows the data for al-Makrizi's Khatat. The x-axis of the graph, that's the bottom of the graph, shows the number of words into the Khatat. So 0 is the start of the work. Yeah. The y-axis of each graph then gives the count for the number of dates for each dynastic era in each section of the work. The black lines at the bottom of each graph give the section boundaries. White spaces mean long sections, and dense black blocks mean lots of sections close together. And the red highlighting sections mean that more than one dynastic era is being mentioned in those sections. From the graph, one can see how al-Makrizi frequently moves between different dynasties in the sections of the Khatat. There's not one clear chronological trend moving from one section to the other. One can see, not unsurprisingly, that Mamluk era dates predominate, especially near the end of the work. And this is not surprising because nearer to the end of the work, al-Makrizi focuses on specific toponyms, many of which were either founded or significantly changed in the Mamluk period. However, pre-Fatimid, Fatimid, and Ayyubid dates all appear in reasonable numbers in different sections of the work and all the way throughout the work. though as you can probably see, Ayyubid dates seem to be much more poorly represented compared to dates from other dynastic eras. Let's compare this now with a graph for another work, al-Nawari's Encyclopedia de Nihaya. The first parts of this work deal with a variety of non-historical subject matters, and so we don't see as many dates being mentioned in the earlier parts of the work. Meanwhile, at the end, the work provides a chronological history that's divided by geography, and we can see this quite clearly in the graph. With each new region, al-Nawari moves chronologically through each dynastic period. Of course, these dynastic divisions that I'm using are not very meaningful outside of Egypt, but you can still see in the graph how he's moving. See the different peaks here. These correspond to different regions, and this large part at the end corresponds to his discussion of the history of Egypt in the final volumes. Now let's compare further to Al-Kashandi's secretarial manual, the Sub al-Ashr. Like the Keynote, it mentions different dynasties across the work, but dynastic periods are combined most extensively in particular sections of the work, where for most of the work there is a predominance of Mamluk era dates. The series of peaks that we see in the second fifth of the graph here correspond to those sections that we're probably most familiar with, where he summarizes the histories of regions and kings and cites examples of letters from different periods of Egyptian history. In conclusion to this paper, I would now like to return to the Keynote and look more closely at how the structure shapes al-Makrizi's reuse of Fatimid era material and narratives, and particularly narratives surrounding the fitna. We know that al-Makrizi gave the fitna a central place in the first fasl that I mentioned at the start of my paper, but it's also clear that he returns to it quite frequently throughout the Keynote. To underline this point, I've put together a prototype visualization. This is quite messy, and I'd like to produce something a little bit cleaner in the future, but it should give you an idea. The top graph gives a variety of terms that al-Makrizi uses to denote destructive events, this graph here. The middle graph gives dates and terms that are typically associated with Fatimid fitna, and the final graph gives terms and dates associated with the Mihan wal Hawadith wal Mihan of 806. What is clear here is that destruction is a theme found throughout the Keynote, and al-Makrizi is seeming to frequently return to both the fitna and the tribulations throughout the work. So these are themes that he keeps coming back to all the way through when he's discussing different places and different historical periods. As he returns to these themes, he addresses them differently depending on the context. The location within the work can have a profound influence on how the Fatimid fitna is framed. There are three main types of section that I'd like to discuss in the Keynote: chronological or historical, topical and topographical, where in the first type, the focus is often on one dynasty or period of Egyptian history. Topical and topographical sections often compare between multiple eras in the same section, and this affects how the fitna is framed. The first example I'm going to present to you is from a chronological section, which summarizes the history of the Fatimid caliphs, starting with the dynasty's origin outside Egypt and summarizing the history of the dynasty all the way through to their demise. The circular graph that I've given on this slide shows text reuse data for the Keynote. This is data produced by the Kitab team using an algorithm that identifies where text is shared between, in this case, al-Makrizi's Keynote and two other texts by al-Makrizi, the Itiaz and the Muqafa. Lines on that graph represent instances of shared text, and this is the start of the work and the end of the work. So you can see the locations of that reuse and how text is moved around. The lines that are in red on that graph correspond to the section on the Fatimid caliphs. So one can clearly see how there's heavy reuse from the beginning of the Itiaz, so that sections discussing the very early days of the Fatimid dynasty are reused in his Keynote. Whereas for the later periods, he's much briefer and gives very summary descriptions in this section. And the description of the fitna is an example of that kind of brief description. In the quotation on the left, I've underlined two sections that I'd like to draw your attention to. So firstly, the fitna is clearly situated within a period of political decline. So we can see in the year 453, the dismissal and appointment of viziers and qadis increased, but the rabble increasingly mingled with the caliph, and the contemplables took precedent, and so forth, so on and so forth. So this contrasts significantly with narratives of the fitna presented elsewhere in the Keynote, but it fits the largely political history that we see in this particular section of the work. Secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to how al-Makrizi is leaning heavily on cross-referencing. This happened until affairs led to the occurrence of the Great Misery, as has been mentioned in its place in this book. On the arrival of the Emir al-Juyush, Badr al-Jamali, in the year 466, and his rise to rule Misr, this is mentioned in his biography under the section on the gates of Cairo. So I think here al-Makrizi is expecting his readers to follow up what he's describing here in other sections of the work. The section on the Shidda that al-Makrizi is alluding to is likely a section found slightly before the one I just discussed in a section entitled The Destruction of Fusṭāṭ. In this section, we find the most detailed description of the fitna in the Keynote. It's a description that shares much of its text with al-Makrizi's chronicle, the I'tiaz. As I've shown with these red lines on the graph here, I've taken away the rest of the text reuse so you can clearly see where that text reuse is happening. But the material is being reframed in two crucial ways. Firstly, al-Makrizi starts his description with the two famines that happened in the 440s. This narrative is also mentioned in the I'tiaz, but it's entirely detached from the narrative of the fitna. This is seen by this large space that you see. It looks small on the graph, but it's a large number of words between the two reuse instances which are being combined in the Keynote. And even more so, in the Keynote, the events are deliberately linked through the phrase, the epidemics increased in Misr, Cairo, and its provinces until the year 454. This implies that the famine was a major factor for the fitna, where in I'tiaz this impression is not given at all. Secondly, al-Makrizi brings the fitna into conversation with other crises in Egyptian history. In the first line of this section, it is situated alongside the 6th, 12th century crisis, which Professor Pradines mentioned briefly, the burning of Misr. And this event is also detailed at length after his description of the fitna. And I quote, "There were two reasons for the destruction of Fusṭāṭ Misr. The first of them was the great misery, which was in the caliphate of al-Mustansir Bilal the Fatimid. The second is the burning of Misr in the viziers of Shawar bin Mujir al-Sa'idi." At the end, however, al-Makrizi also brings in much more recent events, concluding with the phrase, "Thing after thing continued to be destroyed until the year 790. Then destruction intensified in the lanes of al-Qanadil and in the quarter of al-Ḥākim, and people began to demolish the houses of Misr and sell the rubble until it became what it is today." This section, which dedicates significant space to the fitna, therefore brings it into conversation with a broader history of crisis in Egypt, beginning prior to the fitna with the 440s famines and taking it up to al-Makrizi's own time. These are admittedly just two examples. One could draw on many more from this work. On one hand, they speak to the variety of material and anecdotes available to al-Makrizi when writing his text. On the other, they show his playful refitting of the event to suit particular contexts. In the title of this paper, I tried to play with the theme of the conference by suggesting a term, cosmopolitan historiography. To an extent, I think that in the Mamluk period, we might describe historiography as being cosmopolitan. Al-Makrizi, al-Nawiri, and al-Kalkashandi's texts all show a willingness to bring together, learn from, and integrate previous Egyptian dynasties and communities, whether Sunni or Shi'i, into a singular history, bringing different paths into communication with one another. However, these memories are to an extent assembled to serve the purposes of their authors. Al-Makrizi's Keynote, for example, seems particularly preoccupied with crisis throughout Egyptian history, and this prompts him to return continually to the Fatimid fitna. As he does so, he reshapes the material to suit different contexts. In short, as Fatimid historians, I think we should be alive to the organization of our works and how their arrangement of material compares to other texts that describe the same events. Studies of text reuse, I think, are particularly valuable here. Doing this will not only allow us to better understand Fatimid history, but I think it will also show us why certain late medieval authors were so concerned with documenting the Fatimid past in the first place. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. That was fascinating.
So it's a real pleasure and honor to be part of the conference, and particularly to be part of this panel. I feel we're in very exciting times in the realm of historiography and philology, as well as in other realms, which I hope to touch on later. But my talk is going to have quite a lot of, I think, synergy with my co-panelists, and I'll come to that in a moment. The title of my talk is "Who Writes the Fatimids? The Travel and Transmission of Eyewitness Accounts." I'm using the kind of the profile of certain contemporary Fatimid era texts to allow reflections, firstly on the extent to which the kind of archival trace allows kind of germinal, if you like, seminal Fatimid accounts to persist and subsist and prosper, if you like, in data historiography, despite the kind of research agendas that come into play later on. And I then speak a little bit about the question of presentism, how historiography is always a question of using and retrofitting evidence to suit present-day agendas. And it's something that Mathew just touched on as well just now. So I'll hopefully expand on that a little bit further down the line. So I'm going to first begin by paying tribute to my co-panelist, whose work informs and inspires my own, particularly for this presentation. So here are some of the things I've been reading in preparation for this talk. Mathew's PhD thesis, a real magnum opus of depth on al-Yazuri's Sira, and then Shainul's excellent book on, well, one of many of her books, this one in particular on Maqrizi's section of the Itti'ād on al-Mu'izz, and also Professor Lev's work on the uniqueness of the Fatimid state. This article also has, I think, quite a lot of overlap with what I'll talk about today. So it's great to be part or in conversation with these works. So my talk will have a few themes to examine. The kind of overall overriding theme is really about cosmopolitanism construed quite broadly. There probably are technical definitions we could go into, but I'm using the term, insofar as I do use it explicitly, I'm using the term to mean a broad-mindedness, a kind of universal outlook, a lack of focus on self or the kind of Ismailism or the sort of confessional and regional subjective perspective of Fatimids. I find in historiography, whether of the Fatimid era or afterwards, the perspective is much broader than that, even though those subjective perspectives are valuable and important. And we'll talk more about this, the dynamic between those perspectives later on. And then I'll also speak a little bit about normative plurality in historiography. Historiography in this context refers to chronicles and biographies. Those are the main text types I deal with. And I call this normative plurality because it's no longer surprising for us, I think, to see that there's a great plurality of voices, whether on the basis of region or confession or perspective, political or religious. It's really very much the norm. It's not even anything that we need to particularly remark on. So much evidence now exists for that plurality. So I'll begin with the words of Maqrizi, who speaks in the Itti'ād about regional prejudice in history writing. Then I'll talk about Fatimid epistemological power writ large and connect some of the studies that are happening right now, in which we're seeing more and more kind of broad horizons. Our horizons are expanding as we discover more and more about the Fatimids and their ways of projecting themselves, but also projecting a worldview that went beyond their own realm. In other words, their own horizons were broad and ours are expanding as we come to terms with that. I'll then move on to the particular groups of texts that I'm interested in as evidence for the argument I'm making. So I'm going to choose out of many Fatimid era texts a few to examine where they went after they were written, insofar as that can be ascertained. It's a very selective and partial picture because we only have slight evidence as to how widely texts were read, how widely they were copied, and how large their imprint was in the kind of the cultural sphere. And it's clear that while we may have some instances where we can see that a particular later author copied and read a Fatimid era text, there will be a huge amount of non-evidenced reading happening as well, which we can't really reach and we can't really kind of bring into play because we don't have the physical traces of that reading. So it's a partial picture of what I think is a widespread phenomenon of text traveling across borders, confessional, geographical, and so on. From that, we'll move on to the question of preservation of texts, archival practices, and the kind of pruning mentality, what I've kind of jokingly referred to as the Marie Kondo kind of principle. Then I'll move on to how these archival traces allow us to see that the Fatimids' voice or the Fatimid voices, whether the voices of the regime or people who are working with the regime, continue to play a vital role in the way in which the Fatimids are later represented, despite the variety of ways in which the Fatimids are represented in later traditions. And then I'll discuss my kind of current obsession, which is how our framing of historiography, whether in the present day or in the Fatimid era or the Ayyubid and Mamluk eras or in any era, the questions that we ask, the research agendas that we bring to bear on our evidence, I'm calling this presentism, are things we should reflect on explicitly. And I use the word presentism not as a pejorative term, but rather as an epistemologically revealing and important and valuable idea. So that's the shape of the talk. I'll move on quickly. I'm going to try very hard to be less than 20 minutes. Let's see how it goes. So here is a non-exhaustive list of some of the eyewitness accounts that were written in the Fatimid era, many of them by Fatimid insiders, by which I mean men who served the regime, were close to the regime, or lived under the auspices of the Fatimid state temporarily or in the long term. And of these, I will pick a few to think about the kind of textual journeys of some of the works produced by these authors. So I'll just pick out a few. Now, before I begin on that, I think it's worth noting that there's been a lot of work done recently, well, over the last few decades, about the extent to which Fatimid textual production is more extensive than we had thought, scholarship had once appreciated. And the question of how much was produced is not one that can be easily answered because we have the survival bias issue. In other words, we can only comment on what we know has survived into late historiography. Nevertheless, the more we look at the extent to which later historians draw on early Fatimid era accounts, the more we gain an insight into the fact that the issue is not that texts were not produced in the Fatimid era. The issue is that their survival patterns have been extremely patchy. I mean, Mathew in his thesis mentioned that there were a number of texts written in the Fatimid era which were copied wholesale into later texts, in particular by Maqrizi. I've also found this to be the case. I'll speak about one of the case studies I've made previously on al-Qudai in a moment, and I mention al-Qudai in relation to the Fatimid Caliph al-Ḥākim, and I mention al-Ḥākim in particular because I know Shaynul will be speaking about al-Ḥākim, so that I think there's an interesting synergy there. So I'm trying to connect with my co-panelists in this section. But in terms of the extent of Fatimid textual production, we, I think, underestimate how much was written, how much these texts shape later tradition. And I've said here that the smallness of our aperture, in other words, the survival bias that shapes our perception, should not make us oblivious to the kind of the epistemological power of the works produced in the Fatimid realm. I mean, when having sat with these texts for a number of years, when I think about Fatimid kind of self-representation in historiography, to me, it's extremely rich. Even if you compare with, for example, the immense propaganda machine, if you want to call it that, of the early Ayyubid era under Salah ad-Din, or if you even compare with the Mamluk encyclopedic culture, I think Fatimid text production stands up really well. So I don't really buy the idea that historiography was not a central concern of the Fatimids or the men who served the regime. I simply cannot see that assumption to be valid anymore. So I'll begin with al-Musabbihi, al-Qudai will be next. I'll focus a bit more on al-Qudai and then mention a few others in kind of chronological order and try and I'll give a summary idea of some of the textual journeys of these authors. So al-Musabbihi, as many of you will know, was contemporary with the Fatimid Caliph al-Ḥākim. He died in around 1029, and his majestic, very detailed history, a chronicle, if you like, or perhaps a diary is a better term. It does not survive whole. It was in the Escorial and it was destroyed, but a small fragment has survived, covering 1414, part of 1414 and most of 1415 Hijri. That fragment has been published by Thierry Bianchi and Ayman Fuad Sayyid, and Ayman Fuad Sayyid also has collected other kind of quotations from this text and put them together in this article from Annales Islamologiques. So the interesting thing about al-Musabbihi is that he was known to later authors. He was cited most extensively by al-Maqrizi, but aside from al-Maqrizi, he's known to authors before Maqrizi. He was known to Ibn Dhafir, Ibn Muyassar, Ibn Khallikan, in other words, writers east and west, assuming that Ibn Khallikan is partially based in Damascus. What's interesting is that Baudin has highlighted the fact that in Maqrizi's time, a mukhtasar, or a series of selections from Musabbihi's work was available in Mecca, in the city of Mecca, and Maqrizi was able to consult that summary when he went there for the Hajj. So in other words, a text produced in the Fatimid era, written by an intimate of the Fatimid Caliph al-Ḥākim, has a kind of palpable presence in later historiography in al-Maqrizi's work, but also it was being copied and summarized in Mecca of the 15th century. So that's one textual journey. Now, bear in mind that al-Musabbihi is he's said to be a Shafi'i, so he's not an Ismaili as far as we know. Although I don't really like to comment on someone's personal affiliations, because I think these things can be complex, and also how is it possible to necessarily know unless we have kind of irrefutable textual evidence of somebody's affiliations. And it's possible people had multiple affiliations in terms of creed, which may have been a pragmatic way of dealing with interconfessional contexts. So as a Shafi'i, al-Musabbihi is nevertheless writing from an insider's perspective. He tells the story of the court, and it's the goings on there in great detail, and that some of that is preserved in later historiographical tradition across sectarian kind of lines, if you like. So the next person I want to talk about, next historian, is al-Quda'i, who died in 1062. He was a Shafi'i Qadi who served the Fatimid regime. He was the right-hand man of the Vizier al-Jaljarai, who had his hands cut off for a misdemeanor. And al-Quda'i was the man who wrote all his correspondence and kind of did all his administrative work for him. Al-Quda'i produced a longer history, which is not extant, but a Mukhtasar is widely cited. And I have here the manuscript, one of the manuscripts of his Mukhtasar, which is present in the Bodleian, Pocock 270. There are two al-Quda'i manuscripts in the Bodleian, both dealing with this Mukhtasar, or kind of copies of this Mukhtasar. And in this, he presents a portrait of the Caliph al-Ḥākim and his disappearance, which is the theme I'll turn to next. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this historical episode. It's widely discussed in secondary literature, including an interesting piece by Najm Haider in 2008 that has, tells you a great deal about the episode and different readings of it. I have sort of put together kind of my own reading of what the original, kind of interpretations of this event were, the reconstructions, and how the contemporary accounts of this episode, the Caliph basically goes out riding and never returns. And there is speculation in the historiography about whether he was murdered, whether he went into occultation, and if he was murdered, by whom and for what reason. And I won't go into the detail, as I said, but there are a number of accounts which emanate from the era in which the events took place or soon afterwards. Al-Musabbihi is the chief contemporary Fatimid insider who provides an account. However, the complication is that his account is a little bit fanciful and isn't taken up by later authors in numbers. Al-Quda'i, on the other hand, writes a compelling account. It's detailed, it's authoritative, it mentions the probable role of Sitt al-Mulk, the Caliph's sister, in his demise, you could say his murder. And al-Quda'i's account, in contrast with other contemporary accounts from Christian traditions and from Syrian traditions, finds favor in later historiography. So the majority of people who recount the episode, and we're talking Ibn Khallikan, we're talking about Maqrizi, Ibn Zaghdi-Birdi, Bahibres, a lot of later authors turn to al-Quda'i's account for understanding what happened to al-Ḥākim at the point of his death in 1021. So that's another story of textual travel, which again crosses confessional and geographical lines in what's a typical way, I would say. I'll move briefly now to some of the other textual stories of textual travel. You have Umayyah ibn Abi Salt. His text is only preserved in Egypt. It's basically a discussion of his time in Egypt, and then there are other kind of instances. I'm going to briefly mention Ibn Abi Tayy, who preserves a treatise on late Fatimid rule, which is incredibly detailed and valuable. It's copied whole by Ibn al-Farad and from him to Maqrizi. So these are stories of textual travel, which I think reveal that there are eyewitness accounts which really are highly present in later historiography. What does this tell us? I think that this tells us a few things. One is that our understanding of the idea that there are confessional lines of interpretation or biases or prejudices within historiography is very much questioned by these stories of textual travel. What we also need to appreciate is that the presentist prism that I described earlier on at the start of the talk, i.e. the idea that we approach history and historiography through the research agendas that answer our own needs, it's a truism and it's a given. At the same time, I feel that we don't reflect enough on how this is a valuable epistemological register that we can kind of make more of. When a Fatimid era historian presents a story of the Fatimid caliphs or Fatimid populace even, because the populace in the palace have their tensions from time to time, and sometimes the chronicle will take the side of the people, sometimes he'll take the side of the caliph. In any of these kind of reconstructions, the phenomenon where the historian will fit the evidence to suit their research questions and their particular agendas is the norm. And the same is true also of the Mamluk authors who preserve this material. So I've discussed elsewhere the archival trace and the importance of archivality as a value in historiography. At the same time, it has to be borne in mind that historians are also interpreters. They are compiling evidence in order to answer particular questions. And this, I think, brings me to the question of the Fatimids and who is their other. I'm just going to wrap up quickly. I've missed out a few things on this slide, but never mind. It's something that if you're interested, we can bring up in the Q&A. Who is the Fatimids other? It's not obvious who the Fatimids other is, particularly from the historiographical evidence. The Fatimids are written about in a variety of ways. They are interested in people beyond their own community. We know this from the extent of the kind of plurality of Fatimid libraries. So there isn't an obvious Fatimid other, and the responsibility for representing and memorializing the Fatimids falls to a range of authors writing from a range of backgrounds. And so in that sense, I think that the evidence we're seeing now of kind of the epistemological richness and power of the Fatimids in different genres and different veins kind of cements the idea that as we understand better how expansive their horizons were, we are expanding our horizons in understanding the Fatimids. Thank you very much.
So after doing these wonderful journeys across different sources, I'm doing a bit of a deep dive into looking very particularly into the texts. The complex reign of the enigmatic figure of the fifth Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Ḥākim bi-Amr has attracted considerable scholarly attention. The paradoxes of his actions have elicited accusations of mental instability, arbitrary rule, wanton killing, and messianic aspirations, which are juxtaposed with his generosity, justice, direct involvement in statecraft, and popularity among his subjects. The challenges of studying this period are twofold. The idiosyncrasies associated with his reign, so repeated attempts at deciphering his motivations by medieval and modern historians, including those within the Ismaili Dawa, and have allowed a coagulation of legends around him. Secondly, al-Ḥākim's reign bore the brunt of anti-Fatimid polemic in later pro-Abbasid Sunni historiography, as Walker has recently summed up, and I quote, "Sorting out all of this information, separating myth from fact, bias from reality, for a figure of such complexity, replete with ambiguity built into his very character, who was the subject of obvious and subtle hostility from both medieval and modern writers, friends and foe, is not simple, and perhaps is not even possible." End of quote. This paper responds to this conundrum by suggesting a two-pronged approach to address the historiographical problems of al-Ḥākim's reign. First, a close, source textual analysis of specific events of his reign on a case-by-case basis, and second, an examination of prevailing regional trends to contextualize those specific developments within a broader framework. These approaches are applied in this paper to al-Ḥākim's reputed injunction to inscribe the public cursing of the companions of the Prophet across public venues in Cairo. The initial findings of this exploratory study reveal the deep interconnectedness of political and religious developments in Fatimid Egypt with the Abbasid East as well as the Muslim West. The curse inscriptions of 395. In 395, al-Ḥākim is reported to have ordered public inscriptions cursing Abu Bakr, Omar, other companions, and some Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs. Accordingly, inscriptions were written on mosques, markets, bathhouses, roads, and alleyways, with some inscribed in gold. 2 years later, al-Ḥākim ordered their erasure and decreed that the cursing of the companions would be punished. This was followed by his subsequent injunction upholding the Quranic principle of there being no compulsion in religion. So what is the significance of these inscriptions? All major studies on al-Ḥākim discuss the appearance and erasure of these inscriptions, accounting for their significance in 3 distinct ways. Firstly, they claim to symbolize al-Ḥākim's sectarian, anti-Sunni policies, privileging his vision of the imamate and bolstering the Ismaili dawah. Secondly, they are held to demonstrate al-Ḥākim's pragmatism, with his erasure order said to result from his fear of antagonizing Egypt's Sunni populace when confronted with the revolt of the Umayyad pretender Abu Raqwa in 395, which seriously threatened Fatimid Egypt until his death 2 years later. Finally, they are cast as further evidence of al-Ḥākim's instability amidst the issuance and annulment of other promulgations. Let's turn to the sources. And Fawzi, I look very much to dipping into al-Qudai. I haven't for this paper, but certainly will do as the research progresses. The earliest contemporary account on the curses is that of Yaḥyā ibn Saʿīd al-Anṭākī, a Melkite Christian physician who left Egypt in al-Ḥākim's reign due to the restrictions placed on Christians and wrote his Tariq in Byzantine Antioch. In his entry for the year 395, he records, and I quote, "And it was ordered by al-Ḥākim that there should be written on the mosques, walls, and roads curses against Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Muawiyah bin Abu Sufyan and other companions and caliphs of the Banu Abbas." This became weighty for Muslims from the Sunni madhab, and they were filled with fear and shame. In his entry 2 years later, he notes the erasure of these inscriptions, and I quote, "And in that period, al-Ḥākim decreed the scraping of the writing upon the paths and others that cursed Abu Bakr and others whose names had been written." End of quote. In his rendering of al-Ḥākim, the 12th century Syrian historian Ibn al-Qalanisi focused principally on Syria, but documents significant occurrences in Cairo. Yet across the entirety of his work, he makes no reference to the curse inscriptions. This omission may result from either his lack of interest or considering his otherwise detailed reporting that seemingly he did not access those reports related to the curse inscriptions. Among 4 other widely referenced 12th, 13th century Sunni sources, Ibn Zafir, Ibn Hammad, Ibn Khalikan, and Ibn al-Athir, claims that al-Ḥākim ordered the curse inscriptions are documented. A close analysis of the later 3 of these texts reveals that they are in fact replications of one principal report which originated in Sunni circles in 12th century Alexandria. As part of his Akhbar Muluk Bani Umayyad, the 13th century Maghribi author ibn Hamad provides a legend-infused account of al-Ḥākim's reign. In his summation of al-Ḥākim's biography, he relates, and I quote, "Al-Ḥākim was generous with money and a shedder of blood. He killed many eminent people of his dawla and others in cold blood. His biography is the strangest of biographies. In his days, there unfolded many strange affairs. Among these was that during the height of his caliphate, he ordered the writing of curses against the companions on the walls of mosques, palaces, roads, and alleys. And he wrote sigils to all his governors for such cursing, and that was in 395. Then he ordered the removal, decried it, and forbade the practice in 397. Then this continued for a while, and those who cursed the companions were punished." End of quote. In his entry on al-Ḥākim in the Wafayat al-A'yan, the Iraqi-born biographer Ibn Khalikan begins with an introduction to al-Ḥākim that contains verbatim parallels of the Semitic biography found in Ibn Hamad with slight variances. The Iraqi historian Ibn al-Athir provides extended coverage of al-Ḥākim's reign in his Al-Kamil fi Tariq, though his principal focus for these years are Iraq, Iran, and the campaigns of Mahmud of Ghazna. Across all these yearly entries, including that of 395, however, he makes no mention of the curse inscription. In his summative statement on al-Ḥākim, he reproduces almost verbatim the account noted in Ibn Hamad and Ibn Khalikan. Though Ibn Hamad, Ibn Khalikan, and Ibn al-Athir share direct parallels in their treatment of al-Ḥākim, none of them indicate the source of their summative statement. That information is gleaned from al-Makrizi, who relates a segment of the common summative account regarding al-Ḥākim's treatment of the Christians, but not the curse inscriptions. Al-Makrizi names his source as Abul Hasan al-Rawhi. In his Bulghat al-Zurafa fi Tarikh al-Khulafa, al-Rawhi provides the full quote, which has been accepted by the above noted historians. While al-Rawhi's death date remains uncertain, with recent scholarship placing it circa 1170s, he was almost certainly a Sunni scholar from Alexandria, whose father and grandfather are cited amongst the hadith narrators in the late 12th century. As Fierro and Brett have noted, Alexandria emerged as a bastion of Sunni Islam in the final half century of Fatimid rule, in an era where Sunni ascendancy was marked by the appointment of Sunni generals in the army and the proliferation of Sunni madrasas. While this does not resolve the question of veracity, it clarifies that what seem to be three widely circulating formulations are the record of a single author with its own history of textual transmission. The most cited account on the curse inscriptions is that of al-Makrizi, who reports them in his Itiyad and Kitat. The only Shi'i Ismaili source that details the event is the Yemeni Tayyibi Ismaili Da'i Idris Imad ad-Din. These two sources are distinct from the previously mentioned accounts and are congruent with each other in avoiding the direct ascription of the curse inscriptions to al-Ḥākim. In the Itiyad, under the year 395, al-Makrizi states, there was written in the, and I quote, there was written in the other mosques as well as the old mosque, inside and outside, on all walls and on the doors of shops, cornerstones, tombstones, and cenotaphs, curses and insults directed against the companions of the Prophet. They were inscribed and painted with a variety of colors and gold. That was done on the doorways of the bazaars and the doors of houses. End of quote. Immediately thereafter, Al-Makrizi relates the growth of the Ismaili Dawah and of Shi'i-led strife in the period, with some Shia assailing Sunni Hajj caravans about cursing the caliphs. Idris Imad ad-Din in his Uyun al-Akhbar relates, and I quote, "The Shia emerged victorious against those who opposed them during the time of al-Ḥākim, and they publicly cursed those who put themselves forward against Ali, commander of the believers. So much so that plentiful became the insults against Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, Talha, Zubair, and others during that time. This went from private to public. They appeared and were inscribed on the pulpits and on placards and on the doors of bathhouses and wherever people gathered. So the Imam al-Caliph denounced them and pronounced the following words, ordering it to be read to those in the cities and the countryside, telling everyone to remain on their own madhab." End of quote. Significantly, the climate of Shi'i zealousness indicated by al-Makrizi and noted by Idris is reiterated by the 15th century Maghribi Sunni historian Ibn Khaldun. While he recounts al-Hakim's Rafida beliefs as being well known, Ibn Khaldun notably makes no reference to the curse inscriptions either by al-Hakim or otherwise. He reports the Shi'i-led sectarian strife as being potent in al-Hakim's time and states that al-Hakim was opposed to this and therefore issued his edict of tolerance. He notes, and I quote, "It was raised to him that a group of Rafidis approached the Sunnis during the Tarawih, as well as in the funerary prayers, and attacked them. Consequently, a sigil was read out from the Mimbar of Misr, which included, 'The commander of the believers recites to you the verses of God's clear book. There is no coercion in religion.' To the end of that verse, 'None are to curse anyone from the Salaf.' End of quote. Ibn Khaldun and Idris are one generation apart. The striking parallels in their exposition of Shi'i-led strife as the cause of the issuance of al-Hakim's decree of tolerance and their quoting the text of the decree would suggest a common source. Idris's version, correlating with al-Makrizi and paralleling Ibn Khaldun's, is more widely reflected than would have been otherwise assumed. Questioning the prevailing viewpoint. Contrary to the prevailing view that has taken al-Hakim's ordering of the curse inscriptions as a given, the Egyptian historian Abdul Mu'nim Majid, in his Arabic language monograph on al-Hakim in 1955, observed that the sources do not affirm the view that al-Hakim ordered the cursing of the companions, evidencing al-Makrizi and Idris, a point later rejected by Sadiq Asad. Heinz Hamm, in his 1984 article on al-Hakim and in his 2003 monograph on the Fatimids, also questioned al-Hakim's role in the issuance of the decree on curse inscriptions. Referring to the specific wording of al-Makrizi's report, وَكُتِبَ عَلَى أَبْوَابِ الْمَسَاجِدِ, he notes that it did not indicate a formal decree. Hamm further asserts that al-Anṭākī's account does not seem to express a formal decree. He suggests that al-Anṭākī must have presumed that the appearances of such writing in public spaces could only be possible by al-Hakim's orders, but that, and I quote Hamm, "This assumption is not mandatory and is rejected in the Ismaili tradition." End of quote. He then references Idris's account that segments of Egyptian Shi'i community were responsible for the inscriptions. Ham further asserts that al-Ḥākim's agency is only apparent in both al-Anṭākī and al-Makrizi's accounts regarding the erasure of the inscriptions 2 years later. He concludes that as we only hear of measures by the sovereign against the cursing of the companions, their initial appearance was not by an official decree, and that the curse inscriptions likely emerged from zealous members of the Dawah. Ibn Khaldun's reportage lends further credence to this view. A wider reading of events across the Islamic world demonstrates that the curse inscriptions of 395 and the associated civil and sectarian strife are one manifestation of developments in Egypt, which are mirrored in Iraq and Ifriqiya during this period. The 11th century Islamic world witnessed heightened sectarian strife fueled by Sunni Shi'i rivalries with communal identity formation, galvanizing around the principal figures of the Sunni and Shi'i traditions, namely the early companions and the Shi'i imams. Reports for the year 391, 393, 398 and onwards record repeated bouts of rioting in Baghdad between Shi'i and Sunni communities, as well as of strife in Wasit, Karbala and Damascus. The bloodiest accounts, however, relate to Ifriqiya in 407, where the departure of the Fatimids left the Ismaili Shia exposed to being branded as Rafida, and countless were put to the sword. A pivotal figure in this milieu and counterpart to al-Ḥākim was the Abbasid Caliph, al-Qadir Billah. His role in championing Sunni Islam paradoxically coincided with the widening success of the Ismaili Dawah in Iraq and galvanized festering unrest across Abbasid lands. Stung by the expansion of the Fatimid Dawah, which saw in 398 the Shi'i residents of Baghdad publicly proclaim Ya Hakim, Ya Mansur in reference to al-Ḥākim, and by the proclamation of the Uqaylid ruler of Mosul of the Fatimid Dawah in 401, al-Qadir ordered the issuance of the anti-Fatimid Baghdad manifesto that sought to delegitimize Fatimid lineage. Al-Qadir's broader anti-Shi'i campaign was bolstered by the allegiance of Mahmud of Ghazna, whose campaigns in India were marked by severe persecution of adherents of the Fatimid Dawah in Sindh and Multan. To conclude, this exploratory paper does not seek a pronouncement on whether it was al-Ḥākim himself or the Shia of Egypt who ordered the curse inscriptions. It aims to demonstrate that a close textual reading reveals that seemingly widespread reports can be traced to specific textual traditions, and divergence across the traditions, namely those of Ibn Khaldun, Idris, and al-Makrizi, can be in reference to the groundswell of Shi'i zealousness in Egypt and anti-Shi'i sentiments elsewhere, which are better contextualized in light of regional developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jiwa. That was a really fascinating and very fascinating paper. We will now go to Dr. Lev and afterwards entertain questions. We've got Dr. Yaakov Lev next, please. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I had to simplify a bit my presentation and to exclude the writings of Ibn Zawlaq from the discussion. It is simply impossible to discuss both Ibn Zawlaq and Musabihi in the frame of 20 minutes Zoom presentation. So all of my talk will be devoted to the writings of Musabihi embedded in the writings of Ibn al-ʿAdīm of Aleppo. A few words about Ibn al-ʿAdīm. He was a scion of the distinguished Jarad family of Hanafi jurists, Qadis and men of letters in Aleppo. He himself received the best of the traditional education in Hadith, Quran, and Fiqh. He served as a mudaris, a professor of law in two of the Hanafi madrasas in Aleppo, but he is better known for his administrative and diplomatic work he done for the rulers, Ayyubid rulers of both Aleppo and Damascus. He visited frequently Egypt on diplomatic missions and spent his last years in Egypt. Actually, he died in Egypt in 1262. He is very well known due to the works of both David Murray, a book published in 1999, and extensive publications of Anne-Marie Ede concerning Ibn al-ʿAdīm as a historian of Aleppo. His Dictionary of Aleppo has been published in 1998 by Suhail Zakar in Damascus, 3 volumes. It is an extraordinary publication, including indexes and many references to other works. And Ibn al-ʿAdīm himself is really remarkable for his systematic and full quotations of sources. He quotes both authors and titles, gives full details of the quotations, and very rarely refers to some unknown, unnamed publication. He also occasionally refers to oral information he got from his father or other people in his from his social milieu. Because of his frequent visits to Egypt, he was both well familiar with the works of Ibn Zawlaq. Actually, he quotes Ibn Zawlaq more extensively than Musabihi. And the quality of his quotes from Musabihi, for that we must explain shortly what we know about al-Musabihi works in general. Actually, only 18 months of his Akhbar Misr have survived. They cover the period from the events of 2nd Jumada 1440 to Dhul Hijjah 1415. The text is a unique manuscript in Escorial library in Spain and contains 2 very significant signatures of ownership. One by al-Hadi and the second by al-Makrizi. Al-Hadi actually was a neighbor of Makrizi, and to what extent Makrizi had used and not quote the topographical work, the Hittite of al-Hadi, is a big issue in scholarship of Makrizi. Frédéric Baudin has published 2 articles concerning the issue in 2010 and 2014, part of his large publication of Al-Makriziana. But nevertheless, that problem, we know the structure of Musabiq's Akhbar Misr. It was divided to years, to months and to days, and to the months to days, and included extensive section of obituaries. Musabiq's obituaries are very important because he included people from all walks of life, including his neighbor, criminal affairs, sexual affairs, gamblers, and people who usually are outside the scope of historians of the period. Perhaps only Sibt ibn Jawzi's obituary somehow resemble the interest al-Musabih al-Musabihi had in people's from all walks of life he met in Fusṭāṭ, Cairo. He lived in Fusṭāṭ, and actually most of the obituaries are devoted to people, to the civilian strata of the population of Fusṭāṭ. The first identification of al-Musabihi's work in Ibn al-ʿAdīm has been done by Professor Ayman Fuad Said in an article published in 1981 in Anal Islamujid, which included sections of Musabihi found outside the fragments that survive from his Akhbar Misr. The fragments that Professor Said was able to locate cover spread from 1272 Hijri to 405 Hijri. Most of them are from the writings of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, his book about the Qadis of Egypt, and Makrizi's Hittat. But Professor Said also was able to identify at least 3 fragments of Musabihi writings embedded in Ibn al-ʿAdīm's biographic dictionary of the people of Aleppo. When Professor Said published his article in 1981, the full edition of the dictionary was not available yet. And today we are able to locate at least 5 quotations, 5 additional quotations of Musabihi by Ibn al-ʿAdīm. The quotations cover the period of 348 Hijri to 411 Hijri, but they are limited in scope. It means they relate only to people who were in Egypt and came from Aleppo. Therefore, the edition is interesting, but it doesn't expand our knowledge of what Musabihi really wrote and other historical issues. I can quote one entry of Musabihi embedded in Ibn al-ʿAdīm's biographical dictionary. It concerns a person named Abu Ali ibn Kuchuk, who arrived in Egypt in 348, and he tells the love story of his slave girls and what happened to her and to her owner in Egypt. And it is undoubtedly direct quote from Musabihi. That's kind of stuff that Musabihi was interested in, that he included in his obituaries. And there is little doubt that in the second half of the 13th century, when Ibn al-ʿAdīm used to visit Egypt on diplomatic missions, and the short period of time that he lived in Egypt from 1260 to 1262, he was able to see far greater fragments, or perhaps even the whole volumes of Musabihi, and he used them according to the purpose of his biographical dictionary of the people of Aleppo. And the question is, of course, if he was able to see such fragments of the whole volumes of Musabihi in the second half of the mid-13th century, the second half of the 17th century, why we have such a small fragments of Musabihi only? And here is the question about the destruction or the dispersal of the Fatimids library. Professor Bora has discussed the fate of the Fatimid library under Saladin in her article 1214 article in the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society. but I would like to draw attention to other libraries, especially the libraries of Qadi al-Fadil, his son, and his brother. The three of them were great collectors of books. They had huge libraries, and those libraries partially were endowed to madrasas, and partially, apparently, were completely dispersed. And I would argue that the dispersal of these libraries, as well as the destruction of the Dar al-Ilm in Tripoli at the hands of the Franks, the Crusaders, when the town was conquered by them in 1109, is in great measure response for the loss of Fatimid 11th century historiography, especially the writings of Musabbihi. I would like shortly to point out that the situation concerning the writings of Ibn Zawlaq is completely different. We have great or large fragments of Ibn Zawlaq's writing embedded in the dictionary of Ibn al-ʿAdīm, because much of Tulunid and Ikhshidid history and people of the period were connected in Aleppo. Ibn al-ʿAdīm was far more interested in the writing of Ibn Zawlaq than he was interested in the writing of Musabbihi. And the same is true for other authors such as Ibn Sa'd al-Maghribi. And actually, we can state quite confidently that when we deal with the 10th century pre-Fatimid history of Egypt and the early stages of Fatimid history in Egypt, we have large fragments of Ibn Zawlaq's writing, and we are on what can be said cautiously solid historical ground. It is not so concerning the 11th century Fatimid history in Egypt, which is a result to the loss and dispersal of Musabbihi's writing, and the very restricted and functional way that authors like Ibn al-ʿAdīm and later Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani use those writings. And it is a loss that there is no other way to compensate for it. Thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to have you for our second session now. And the first one, of course, was looking at Fatimid historiography, and now we are ready to venture into Fatimid encounters with the contemporary cultures around them. And for this panel, we really have quite a distinguished offering, I think, with Professor Rapoport, who is a professor in Islamic history at Queen Mary University. We have Professor Marina Rustov, who is a professor of Jewish civilization in the Near East and of professor of Near Eastern Studies and of history at Princeton. Very, very pleased to have both of you, as well as, of course, Dr. Stephen Kurtz, who has very recently completed his doctorate at Georgetown University. And finally, we have Dr. Shiraz Hajiani, who has his doctorate from the University of Chicago and has been a recipient of a Fulbright Research Scholarship. Their topics are already listed in the program, so I won't take their time, and I'll invite Professor Rapoport to start us off for the afternoon panel.
Thank you very much, Ainur. It's a pleasure to be here. I will try now to share my screen. Thank you very much for allowing me to present here. This is the results of many years of work on this particular manuscript of the Book of Curiosities. The Book of Curiosities, or in Arabic, Kitab Gharaib al-Funun wa Mulah al-Uyun, is the title of an anonymous work that came into light only in the year 2000, not very long ago. It was the manuscript copy was bought by the Bodleian Library in 2002, and since then has been the object of research by Professor Emily Saville-Smith of Oxford and myself. This is, many of you are familiar with this work. It is, it was composed in Fatimid, Egypt, probably in Cairo, in the first half of the 11th century, based on internal evidence. It shows allegiance to the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo, and it is clearly associated with the Ismaili Shia missionary, with the Dawah. And one of the most famous images from it is the map of the city of Mahdiya that has been reproduced widely, including on Professor Daftary's History of the Ismailis. The book, that, as we have it, the manuscript, which is not the original copy, but as a copy made sometime at the end of the Fatimid period or just after it, is divided into two sections, one on the sky and one on the earth. I will not deal in this talk with the section on the sky, which has a lot of astronomical and astrological material, but rather with the book on the earth, which includes 17 unique maps and diagrams, in addition to the text that describes places and spaces on earth. The focus, the unique focus of this manuscript or this treatise is on the Mediterranean, and especially on waterways, that is seas, rivers, lakes, islands, and bays. The majority of the maps deal with the Mediterranean, and the most famous one you can see here on the slide, this oval Mediterranean Sea with many islands indicated as circles in the middle of the sea. But we have several representations of the Indian Ocean, of India, and of Central Asia. And my purpose of the talk today is really to discuss the implications of these maps, the representation of the space by a Fatimid author in the first half of the 11th century. What does these representations, what does this knowledge tell us about the Fatimids as a global empire, or as the title of this conference, a cosmopolitan empire? So I really focus on two maps here, especially the map of the Indian Ocean. So you see, again, an oval shape like the Mediterranean, and a map, untitled map, that shows the Indus and the Ganges rivers. Let me start with the map of the Indian Ocean called here, Bahr Fars. This map is in fact two maps. It's divided in the middle into a right-hand half, which actually depicts India, China, and the land of the Turks in between, as well as islands en route to China. The left half of the map depicts the Gulf of Aden and islands and villages on the East African coast. I will first deal with the right half of the map, and then come back towards the end to the East African half. And I know this looks very strange as a map, but I will now have a slide that explains the labels. So this is the right-hand half that you just seen, with these mushroom-like projections from the central of the oval. The mushrooms are mountains from which rivers flow into the sea. And you see a place name in India at the top, then the lands of the Turks at the corner, and from there to China, places in China at the bottom. Transcription of the labels on the islands in the middle show that these names are taken from accounts of travel in the Indian Ocean towards China in the 9th century by the author Suleiman the Merchant, who wrote it in 851, and from Ibn Khawardazbi. There is no updated information on this map. This suggests that the Fatimids did not travel directly to China. And this is not surprising. Mas'udi says in the 10th century that travel has basically ceased, and Abu Zayd al-Sirafi also says that as a result of the Wang Chao uprising in what is today Canton, Guangzhou, then foreigners were targeted, and there was a halt to direct travel from, let's say, Basra to China. So this map, in a way, is a wonderful demonstration, visual demonstration of a sea route that doesn't seem to exist anymore by the time our Fatimid author was writing. Or this he didn't have a first-hand knowledge. Very briefly, I will talk about another map of the river Oxus in Central Asia. This map, which has the Aral Sea at the center, as a green space in the center, to which the Amdarya or Oxus, as well as the Sir Darya, both flow. The design of this map is taken wholesale from the 10th century author Ibn Hawkal. There's no itinerary here towards China. There's no Silk Road in a way. So again, I deduct here absence from this map. It's a fine illustration of the courtly culture of knowledge, of scholarship, of earlier knowledge accumulated in the 10th century, but it doesn't suggest Fatimid direct knowledge of these areas in Central Asia. The most important map of this manuscript in terms of global communication networks of the 11th century, or at least the late 10th century, is this map. This is a very strange map if you think about the actual geography of India. There's no name here for the river, but the place names clearly show that we have here a river that flows from the mountain of Tibet, written a bit incorrectly, Tibet, but undoubtedly Tibet, flowing towards Kannauj near modern Delhi, and then doing another curve, and then flowing through Sindh into the green Indian Ocean. There's no river like that in India. It mistakenly shows the Indus and the Ganges together. The major cities shown are Mansoura, Multan, both in the Sindh Valley, Kannauj, near modern Delhi, and we have two major itineraries, one from Multan, not along the river, but crossing land towards Kannauj, and then from Kannauj to China, or the gate of China. This is a set of two unique itineraries that are not otherwise attested as such. Just to clarify, at the time, Kannauj is the capital of a Hindu dynasty that still rules central India. Only Sindh was under Muslim control at the time. If we try to plot the itinerary on this map, on a modern map, we can see that this is likely to be an itinerary from Multan in the upper Indus Valley towards Kannauj. Kannauj stopped being a political capital by the beginning of the 11th century, but Biruni still sees Kannauj as the commercial center of all of India, the nodal point from which all routes in India go out or terminate, depending on where you're going. So the route is likely, as it is away from the river, the route is likely from Multan to Kanauj across the desert. The names along the way are really hard to decipher because they are transcription and perhaps even a miscopying of the original names in Sanskrit. However, the context, the political context, is undoubtedly the Ismaili Emirates of Mansoura and Multan that were established first, the one in Multan in 970. This is evidence of the importance of these emirates for the Fatimids in Cairo and the way they could utilize their influence further east. The second part of the itinerary is even more astounding for a treatise composed in Cairo. It shows an overland passage from central India, from Kanauj, through Prayag, Benares, Pataliputra, and then to a city called the Gate of China, which is likely Xi'an, the capital of China at the time. The likelihood, there are several possibilities. Tencent Sen, in his book, discussed, before the discovery of this Book of Curiosities, discussed routes between India and China in this period, and the most likely route is through Nepal and Tibet. It's also described by al-Biruni as something taken by at least one Muslim merchant to try to go up the mountains and go through Tibet to China. Going now to the East African half of the map of the Indian Ocean that I showed you. What we have here is really a detailed depiction of Aden, of the Gulf of Aden and the East African coast. First of all, the Somali coast facing Aden, and then going south along the East African coast. So what you have on the map, you can see it here, but I think it's much clearer in the transliteration. We have Aden at the bottom, and then lands of Yemen here. You have the lands facing Aden here, and most prominently Ras Gardafoun, Ras Gardafoui, which is literally the tip of the Horn of Africa, and then you have also a label for Ras Khafun. So we presume that this is a visual representation of Ras Gardafoun, very likely to be by someone who actually traveled along the coast, or at least had a first-hand report of how the Cape appears to someone on a boat. And then you have here villages that really lie along the northern Somali coast, as well as a few places as well, like the Maldives and the famous Wak Wak Islands. At the top of this map here, you have names for several islands lower down on the East African coast. The island of Zanzibar, called here Unguja, is actually shown also as a square in the middle of the ocean. This is the first time, as far as we know, that the name Unguja, as well as the name for Mafia, another important island on the East African coast, are mentioned in any Arabic source. The island of Susmar, which is Persian for crocodile, is also mentioned, and this is likely to be a reference to the very important commercial entrepot of Pemba. The details for both the Somali coast, especially the Somali coast, but also here, are more, this is the most detailed account of the Somali coast, for example, until the 15th century. And it is especially important given that Fatimid commercial relations with East Africa are rarely documented. And in fact, there has been quite a debate about whether the Islamization of East Africa has been through Iran or through the Fatimid influence. And most research has actually indicated a Persian route, and this is the common account by Swahili people themselves. But in fact, the Book of Curiosities evidence points to a much closer association and first-hand acquaintance with the East African coast by Fatimid authors. And we have other indications, like this hoard, the Mtambwe hoard, found in Pemba in 1984, which has Fatimid gold coins, about 7, dating from this period. And of course, and this will be discussed later on in this conference, the rock crystal, which originated most probably in East Africa, and Professor Pradines, before he moved on to Fusṭāṭ and Cairo, discussed with me his findings regarding crystal in the Comoros and Madagascar. So it may well be that the crystals, the Fatimid crystals, have come exactly through that route that is shown on the map of the Book of Curiosities. To conclude, putting all this in historical context and thinking of the implications of these maps. First, I think that the Gulf of Aden emerges here as a key to the spread of Israeli propaganda and commerce in the East Indian Ocean. We now understand, I think, how important was Ismaili da'wah in the Yemen and the later establishment, later I mean by the 1060s, or 1040s in fact, of the Sulaihid in Yemen, of Ismaili dynasty in Yemen, was so important because Aden held the key to the spread of Ismaili power, soft power in the Indian Ocean. The river map, the Indus-Ganges river map, suggests that holding power in Sindh since 970 through the principalities of Multan and Mansura meant that the Fatimids were able to then connect with the Hindu powers of central India, and then from there, even to China. This was completely unattested before, as far as we know, and shows how the importance of these footholds in Sindh for commerce, for missionary activity, and of course, also in this Book of Curiosities, we see India functioning as a font of knowledge regarding astronomy and astrology and esoteric fields which were very important to the Ismailis. The knowledge, the direct knowledge of East African coasts and islands suggests that East Africa was important to the Fatimids more than we realize. And the rock crystal are actually a manifestation of commercial relations that we don't often see. The knowledge is through missionaries. There is even a mention of an Aqib, a missionary, in relation to Africa in one of the chapters of the book. And final note here is that the Indian Ocean is a sea of commerce. It is not a field for naval activity by the Fatimids in this period, in the 11th century, unlike the Mediterranean, where the Mediterranean map, where the military activities are very much pronounced. The Indian Ocean is seen as two halves, is not conceived as coherently as the Mediterranean as well. We have from Aden coming out into spheres of the Indian Ocean, of India, and from India, a kind of loose connection there, from there to China. So I think these maps together, I hope, show you how really global the Fatimid Empire is, not just a Mediterranean empire, but truly global empire that tries to exert influence, if not militarily, but at least through missionary activity and commercially, up to India and even to China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rapoport.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to be saying some very similar things to what my dear colleague, Yosef Rapoport, just said, but we didn't actually discuss this ahead of time. But I'm using different sources, so independent corroboration. So there are several hundred documents related to the Indian Ocean trade that survived in the Cairo Geniza. Jewish traders turned to the India trade around 1080 for reasons that still aren't well explained or understood. And they continued, or at least the information that we have about it continues until 1240. But there's plenty of evidence for the Indian Ocean trade before that, most famously from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written in the 1st century in Greek, possibly written in Egypt. So this is a very, very old trading network that goes back a long way, way before Jews actually plugged into the trade in the late 11th century. So it doesn't become directly visible in Geniza evidence until the last decades of the 11th century. For a long time, it was assumed that the part of the Indian Ocean to which Jews turned was the western side of it, but it turns out there were Jewish traders in the eastern Indian Ocean as well. On the one hand, that's surprising because there's no survey of Jewish history, to the best of my knowledge, that mentions the presence of Jews in Southeast Asia in the Middle Ages, although there should be. But on the other hand, it shouldn't surprise us at all because there's plenty of other evidence connecting Southeast Asia and China with the Abbasid, Fatimid, and Ayyubid worlds, especially archaeological evidence, but also travel accounts, including the ones that Yossi was just discussing. So the big takeaway of my paper today is that the cosmopolitan Fatimid world extended into places that weren't ruled by Muslims, but exactly how that happened still remains to be explored. So I'm going to offer some of the Geniza evidence for the Indian Ocean trade. The fact that we know so much about the documentary Geniza at all is actually because of the Indian Ocean trade. It was Indian Ocean trade letters that inspired Goitein to turn his attention to Geniza documents in the first place. On a trip to Budapest in 1947, he found letters of Indian Ocean merchants, such as this one, sent from Aden to Mangalore in the 1130s. And he announced his finds in the flagship Journal of Medieval Studies, Speculum, in 1954. He then went on to identify a corpus of several hundred India trade documents over the course of the next years, but he published very few of them himself. Instead, as everybody here is probably aware, he devoted his attention to the Mediterranean. And he turned to the Mediterranean because, as Peter Miller has demonstrated, starting in the 1950s, the great Mediterranean historian Fernand Braudel and his laboratoire funded Goitein to publish on the Mediterranean. So you could legitimately ask what the world of the Cairo Geniza would look like had it not been for Braudel. Instead of a Mediterranean society, would we have an Indian Ocean society? I think probably not, because there are actually fewer than 1,000 documents that we know of on the Indian Ocean trade from the Geniza, as against several thousand on the Mediterranean. But it's still worth considering because the fact that Goitein decided to treat the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean not together as he had originally planned, but in two separate works, has, I think, made it a bit more challenging for us to try and reintegrate the two spheres, the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. In fact, they were inseparable. And a significant quantity of what was traded in the Mediterranean came from the Indian Ocean trade. The Indian Ocean world is overrepresented in two sectors of the market. One is commodities that couldn't be obtained locally, such as pepper, camphor, cloves, aromatic woods, and lac, and luxury manufactured goods, such as copper, porcelain, and certain kinds of silk. But even the whole problem of commodities and manufactured goods has yet to really be laid out and explored. When Goitein died in 1985, he left behind a vast warrant of files, including 26,000 well-ordered index cards, more than 2,000 unpublished transcriptions of Geniza texts, which were digitized on the Princeton Geniza Project website. So Goitein left, sorry, that keeps disappearing, more than 2,000 unpublished transcriptions of Geniza texts, which were then digitized in the Princeton Geniza Project database, including by some of the people at this conference, because they were graduate students at Princeton and they worked on this. And he also left thousands of pages of notes on topics ranging from abandoned wives to sugar sellers, from Al-Andalus to Sumatra. There's really everything in this kind of mountain of material, including unfinished transcriptions and translations of 459 documents on the India trade, again, dating to the period between 1080 and 1240. So had you tried to consult this material 15 years ago, you would have tried in vain, because Goitein never published it. And then it was all but embargoed as one of his students, Mordechai Akiva Friedman, started to bring the texts out to publish them. So the bottom line right now is that volumes 1 through 3 exist in English translation. Because Goitein lived and worked in Israel until 1957, many of his notes on the Indian Ocean trade, especially the kind of written commentaries, are in Hebrew, and consequently Friedman published volumes 1 through 4 of a projected 7 volumes in Hebrew, a language that most of the people who study the Indian Ocean trade before the Portuguese do not in fact read. Volumes 5 through 7 will also be published in Hebrew, not by Friedman, but by the next generation of scholars, including Miriam Frankel and Amir Ashur. And the result of this is that the Geniza material on the Indian Ocean trade has only just begun to be processed by historians of the pre-modern Red Sea and South Asia. So here are some excellent recent titles in order of appearance from right to left. You can see that Amitav Ghosh was a real pioneer because he did this stuff long before the material actually existed in anything but archival form. As for historians of Southeast Asia, to the best of my knowledge, they haven't begun to process the relevant Geniza material at all, a situation that I attempted to change by dropping this article online last week, but it's really like just a beginning. So I'm going to give you a few examples, 5 examples of what's in this material as a way of mapping the Indian Ocean trade. So I'll be looking in particular at the western and eastern edges, the Red Sea on the one hand and Southeast Asia on the other. My first example is a letter from a Libyan Jew who is new to the India trade, writing from the Red Sea. And this is a letter that was first brought to my attention by Roxani Margheriti in an article on the Dahlak archipelago in the Red Sea. The letter was supposed to appear in Goitein's 6th and still unpublished volume of Indian Ocean documents. I've now edited and translated the text together with Alan Elbaum at the Princeton Geniza Lab. It's from a Libyan Jew in Dahlak, so he's away from home and he's writing back home to his brother-in-law in Tripoli in 1103. And he's writing basically to complain about business travel. Now, why he's complaining, I think there's a bit of guilt because he left home unexpectedly. So he's saying, look, I'm not like really enjoying myself out here. But it's also true that complaining about business travel, besides being like universal to the human race, also served specific purposes in merchants' correspondence. So what our guy says is that after leaving Libya, I went up to Fusṭāṭ, where I ran into Makhlouf ben Moshe, known as Happy Eyes. So this person, Happy Eyes, also known as Makhlouf ibn Musa al-Nafusi, is a fellow Libyan whom the author must have known from home. And Happy Eyes would become legendary to those in the India trade, not just for his longevity in business, but also for his terrible character and unreliability and general flouting of social norms. So you can imagine, if you will, the writer of this letter running into Happy Eyes and drinking in some portside tavern, because both taverns and alcohol-fueled business negotiations are attested genres in the Geniza. So Happy Eyes is telling tall tales about the wonders of India, and our young writer from Libya is persuaded, so he decides to set out for India. I talked to him about living in India, he says, and he told me about its rural villages, and it immediately entered my mind to travel to India. We didn't read the verse in Proverbs that says, the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. In other words, later I would regret this decision, he says, and I'm not sure he really regretted it, but that's what he says here. So I left Fusṭāṭ at the end of Iyar of the year 4863, according to the Jewish calendar, which is 1103. And we reached Qus after 2 months. So the route that he would have taken is you travel up the Nile to Qus, and then you cross overland to Qusair. And the reason for that is that there are some coral reefs and some bad winds in the northern Red Sea that you would want to avoid. And at that point, you would set out on the Red Sea and you'd hit the following ports in order: Aydab, Sawakin, Badia, until finally you get to Dahlak, which is where he's writing from. And after Dahlak, you would reach Aden, and from Aden, then you could actually sail in open water rather than along the coast, depending on what the monsoon was doing. If it wasn't the right season, then you could go along the coast, but it would have been dangerous to go along the coast during the monsoon season. So at that point, you would prefer open water sailing. So he's at Qus now, still that Nile port, and he says, then I entered the desert and stayed there for some days, after which I arrived in Aydab. And here he begins a series of rhyming complaints. Aydab, which is truly a city of adab, tribulations. So there's Aydab, and two interesting things happen here. The first is that he flips into rhyme, and he'll stay in rhyme all the way to Dahlak, because only rhyme can convey the true force of his complaints. And the second is that he switches boats from a Mediterranean craft to an Indian Ocean craft, and he's going to tell us about that as well. So he says, then we departed, setting sail in a ship that contained not a single iron nail, but rather was tied together with ropes. May God protect us with his shield. Now, he's a Mediterranean man, so he's never seen a boat without nails, and he's utterly terrified. But of course, this is totally typical of Indian Ocean craft, which were, and in some cases still are, built not with nails, but with very, very good joinery of teak wood, which is sewn together. The planks are sewn together with coconut coir ropes, which resist water really quite well, and then laminated with lime and some kind of animal or vegetable fat. That's just the traditional boat construction that we have plenty of evidence of on the Indian Ocean, but he didn't know that, and he didn't know it was safe. So he's very terrified at this point. And then he says, we arrived at a city called Sawakin. This is one of these Red Sea ports, which is truly a most frightening place, a Khad Mawakin. He invents a plural here, just for the sake of the rhyme. Then we arrived at a city called Badia, which you could translate as the one that cuts, for it is just as the name says, the most bitter, frightening, miserable of places. Then we arrived at a city called Dahlak. The following adage is said about it, but you surpass them all. It is a ruinous land, balad muhlik. In any case, God, may he be powerful and exalted, did not destroy us in his mercy. So no one died, it was great, but the cities are terrible. And by the way, this pun on Dahlak and muhlik, or ahlaka, is he's not neither the first nor the last person in the Middle Ages to make that exact pun on Dahlak. So aside from having some really good letter writing, when was the last time you wrote an email like this? One striking thing in this letter is the low bar to entering the Indian Ocean trade. It's as though all it took was for this gentleman to run into his compatriot from Libya, and then off he goes to India. The second striking thing is the connection between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, because even if this Libyan was somewhat shocked, or claimed to be somewhat shocked, to be boarding an Indian Ocean style vessel, it's clear that Egypt sat astride the two trade systems with predictable consequences for merchants' income on the one hand and for Fatimid taxation on the other. My second example also talks about a place that sat astride the two trade systems, in this case, Aden, which is the hinge between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. This is a letter on which Elizabeth Lambourne and Phil Lieberman published a very good article in 2016. It was sent by a ship owner and merchant in Aden named Madmoun ibn Hassan, or Yefet in Hebrew. Hassan and Yefet are the same name, who was head of the Jewish community in Aden, and he's writing to a big Mediterranean trader in Fusṭāṭ. And the purpose of his letter is to send a number of gifts to the officials of the Jewish community in Fusṭāṭ. And he's sending 2 kerchiefs of a particular kind of silk that's made in Kolam in southern India, one with red edges and another with green edges. And he's also sending 6 porcelain tumblers from China. So commodities from South Asia are well attested in the India trade letters. What's interesting here are commodities from East Asia. But no sooner does Madmoun send these Chinese porcelain tumblers to officials of the Fusṭāṭ Jewish community, then he suddenly doubts the propriety of the gift. So I'm not going to read this, I'll just summarize it in the interest of time, but basically porcelain looks like glass, but actually isn't glass. So the question is, for the purposes of Jewish law and ritual purity, does it behave as glass or does it behave as ceramic? And this is a question on which there is debate. What interests me, however, is a bit different, which is the fact that Chinese wares made it to Fusṭāṭ via Aden, which answers a lingering question among archaeologists, George Scanlon in particular, who was at pains to explain how there was so much Chinese ceramic at Fusṭāṭ. Scanlon's excavations in Fusṭāṭ turned up thousands of Chinese sherds. One is this 10th century porcelain bottle now at the Princeton Art Museum, but it's on display in the East Asian section. And I never would have known that it was from Fusṭāṭ had I not been rummaging around in Scanlon's correspondence, where he mentions having excavated it there, along with some more familiar looking local Egyptian ceramics. In fact, a later analysis revealed that most of the medieval ceramics that Scanlon excavated at Fusṭāṭ were in fact from China.
Whoa.
So that brings me to my third, fourth, and fifth examples, which are from the other end of the Indian Ocean, from Southeast Asia. Here, there are some commodities that I just want to bring to your attention. This is a letter that mentions camphor from Fansur in Sumatra. So we have some wonderful lists of prices here. These are always really good to have and compile. Pepper sells for 30, which I can assume means dinars per qintar. A qintar is 45 kilos, as opposed to white pepper, which sells for 1 dinar per man, and a man is nearly a kilo, 800 grams. And old Fansuri camphor, I don't know what the significance is of the camphor being qadim, maybe somebody can tell me, but old Fansuri camphor is selling for 100 dinars per man. Okay, so there's 100 dinars for less than a kilo. This is an extreme luxury commodity that certainly not everybody would have been able to afford unless they bought in absolutely tiny quantities. So that is Fansuri camphor, as opposed to Chinese camphor, which is also a product that we see attested in these letters. Fansuri camphor in this letter, which is undated, but probably early 12th century, Fansuri camphor is selling now for 80 dinars per man, so the price has gone down, but Chinese camphor is much, much cheaper. It's selling for, we don't know how much because all it says is blank ashar because there's a hole in the manuscript, but it's somewhere between 11 and 19 dinars per man. So a much cheaper grade of camphor. So now, of course, you can trade products from a place without ever actually visiting the place. But what's fascinating about this letter that I'm showing you is that if you flip it over and look at the back, there is an address in unpointed Arabic script that has some holes in it and is not easy to read. But Mordechai Friedman has read it tentatively, but I think plausibly, as addressed to Lawamand, which is an island in the Mergui archipelago off the coast of southern Myanmar. So it is entirely possible that you have a Jewish trader in the northern Malay Peninsula. We know that Jewish traders also went to the middle part of the Malay Peninsula for reasons that I don't have time to explain. This is just to add to the whole thing about Fansur and Sumatra, a legal query from the 13th century to the son of Moses Maimonides, Abraham Maimonides, asking a certain legal question to do with the death of a Jewish trader in Fansur. Okay, and my final example is also from the court of Abraham Maimonides. This is a court testimony dated 1226. It's in Maimonides' handwriting, which is horrendous, and it's regarding the death of a trader in Kala. So there's lots of debate in the literature among Southeast Asian historians about exactly where Kala is. We know it is in the Malay Peninsula. And I had delusions of grandeur and thought that I could actually solve this problem by figuring out what is in the lacuna in this letter, because Goitain, when he translated the letter, couldn't read what was after Kala on this line. Basically, it says, Kala min bilad something or other. and Goitain could not read the rest. So I spent a long time staring at it with my my colleague Michael Laffin, who's a historian of Southeast Asia, and we figured it out. We figured out what's in the lacuna. I did not figure out where Kala was, but the document is interesting for other reasons. Long story short, it turns out that the crucial lines say that a trader named Abu al-Fadl ibn Mukhtar al-Iskandari al-Ma'ruf, who is known as Ibn something or other. There's a blank here, so we can't read his name. Tuwufia, that he died fi Kala min bilad, and the word that I read is al-Jawa. In other words, that Kala is in Java. Okay, now things get complicated. I told you that I had solved the problem, but I just introduced a new problem. Why is Kala being described as in the lands of Java? Kala isn't in Java. We know it's over here, although we don't know exactly where in the Malay Peninsula. And Java is obviously this island over here. In fact, in Arabic usage of the Middle Ages, Java was not this island over here. It was actually the entire region of Southeast Asia, a region that Yaqut al-Hamawi, who was a precise contemporary of this document of Abraham Maimonides, described as the first part of China. So Java, in other words, was the gateway to China. And in Maimuni's court record, Jews in Fusṭāṭ are recording the fact that a trader has died in a place that they called Java, that they knew of, and that they knew to be a realm at the end of the Indian Ocean, a place that you had to go to, not just if you wanted to cross over to China, but also if you wanted to buy Chinese wares. There is archaeological corroboration that I won't have time really to get into, but I just want to mention that there's a shipwreck in the Java Sea that was discovered in 2003. The Cirebon wreck is usually what it's called in the literature. And there's a fantastic dissertation about it from 2014 by Horst Liebner, which argues, based on a meticulous analysis of the cargo distribution, the following. There are 500 to 600,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics that were found in this wreck, as well as Chinese coins, metalware, silver ingots, pearls, precious stones, probably from Indian Ocean ports, glass perfume flasks, and rock crystal of Middle Eastern and possibly even Fatimid origin. The ship has been dated, I said, to after 968. Okay, so this is fully Fatimid period. And several hundred kilos of lapis lazuli from Khorasan, bronzeware from India, and then various local Southeast Asian products. So when Liebner looked at the distribution of cargo in the wreck, this is what he determined. The ship had loaded its Chinese wares first in China, and then it had loaded the Chinese wares first, we assume somewhere that wasn't near the Java Sea, so probably China. And then it had loaded its Fatimid, Central Asian and South Asian cargo. So what does that mean? It means that this ship probably picked up its Chinese wares in China, but it picked up its Fatimid wares in Southeast Asia. So I think we need to be looking to Southeast Asia as an entrepot for goods, both Fatimid goods traveling eastward and also Chinese goods and Southeast Asian goods traveling to Egypt. Okay, in sum, I've shown you a Libyan who gets into the Indian Ocean trade very easily, but he has no idea what an Indian Ocean craft looks like and is terrified. I've shown you Chinese porcelain that gets to Aden and thence to Fusṭāṭ, but no one in Fusṭāṭ knows what its status is in Jewish law. And I've shown you Mediterranean traders who get to Southeast Asia, even if back home in Fusṭāṭ, people can't be very specific about Southeast Asian geography. They just say al-Jawa, and they mean all of Southeast Asia. So it's clear that the Islamic world was connected not just with South Asia, but with Southeast and East Asia as well. And that it was connected not merely overland via the so-called Silk routes. And there's a lot of vagueness that goes into that term Silk routes, as Yossi has just explained to us. We have to be very precise about what those routes were, but also via maritime trade. However, not all of those connections were direct. Now, Goitain makes a really big deal out of there being no direct route to China that you can see from the Geniza material on the Indian Ocean. But I would argue that a segmented trade system, oh, more stuff from the shipwreck, sorry about that. I would argue that a segmented trade is actually better in this period because you are gathering information along the way. Trade is not just a transactional activity. It's an activity of information transfer, of reputation management, of network building. And the more stops you make, the more easily you're able to do all of those things. So even a segmented system can be a coherent one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. That was much appreciated and really builds on what Yossi set the stage with this afternoon. So this is wonderful. Look forward to a very rich discussion following these presentations. So over to you, Shiraz.
Thank you, Shainul. I guess a comment and now for something completely different would be appropriate. I first of all want to thank the organizers for this invite. I note that this forum is for established and early career scholars, and having done that about 7 years ago, I'm glad the Institute is doing it, and I'm sure that this will be very productive. It's been lovely to hear the presentations so far. As I contemplated this, I thought, on a scale of 0 to Dr. Jiva on Fatimid cosmopolitanism, I don't even rank at Jared Kushner. So you will not have any Adam Accords coming from me today, and I will not be issuing a sigil on cosmopolitanism in the world. But here's my plan. My hope is that I'm just trying to arrange my screen a little bit. My hope is that I will share my meditations on the category cosmopolitanism, my somewhat unease with the term. I'll survey some individuals, groups, and events that fell outside of what might be called Fatimid cosmopolitanism. And then I want to talk about the possibility of the notion of soteriology and how that relates to cosmopolitanism. Can a community that has a truth claim actually espouse cosmopolitanism in that sense? So I want to probe the categories, both Fatimid and cosmopolitan, because I'm coming from a particularly different angle in this discussion. And finally, I want to think about the issue. I want us to think about the issue of totalizing constructions, whether they're negative or positive. So, thinking about cosmopolitanisms, one early example that Martha Nussbaum actually mentions comes to mind is Diogenes the Cynic of Sinope. When he was in Athens and asked, "Who are you?" he replied, "I'm a cosmopolitus." And later in Corinth, when Alexander supposedly came to him and said, "Ask me for anything you want," he says, "Get out of my light." And these are nice little statues depicting those images. But I was interested to look at the issue of cosmopolitanism. And this is an engram from Google just done a couple of days ago. And I want to map onto this some of the events that are happening. So this is from the 1750s to the corpus goes up till 2019. So we have the French Revolution in 1789, and pretty soon afterwards, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And there's some writing that begins here, and Kant is writing Perpetual Peace in response to the rise of nationalism in Europe. And then there are some impacts with the colonial endeavors, the pernicious colonial endeavors, and the Indian Revolt of 1857 becomes a point where perhaps cosmopolitanism becomes part of academic discourse. World War I perhaps was also a turning point, but clearly one of the biggest turning points is World War II, the Holocaust, and then the resultant finding of the United Nations. But here at the right end, you see a meteoric rise in this term cosmopolitan being used, and it is coming from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the world post 1991. I did a search of JSTOR and I got almost 45,000 hits on cosmopolitanism. In academia.edu, which has 28 million papers and some 170 million users, there were 1,744 papers with cosmopolitanism in the title. There were 67 hits from full text searches, and the category or the group Cosmopolitanism has almost 18,000 followers. And I thought it'd be fun to just map what's going on with the term Fatimid. And you can see almost an equivalent meteoric rise, and perhaps due to the larger core and new generations of scholars that have emerged in this century. So what is this discourse? How do people think about cosmopolitanisms? Well, one of the critique is that it is Euro-American centric. Gurminder Bhamra wrote that what appears striking is not just the sociological, but also the wider academic literature on cosmopolitanism is the extent to which being cosmopolitan as a practice is associated with being in the West. And it is being of the West as well. Thomas Bender, comparing the British segregation of peoples in India as compared to the Ottoman millet system, he argued that the Ottomans supported pluralism and tolerance, and called tolerance a cosmopolitanism light, which doesn't necessarily demand self-reflexivity. There are other such understandings of cosmopolitanism as a resort of minorities or the marginalized, cosmopolitanism versus pluralism, multiculturalism, presentist retrojections. And there are different flavors of cosmopolitanism: political, trading, intellectual, post-colonial, vernacular, and attempts to write bottom-up understandings. So on this slide, what I've done is I've presented some events and moments that I believe are breakdowns of cosmopolitanisms a la Fatimid cosmopolitanism. The first one starts off with in 9/11, at the instigations of the Imam Khalif al-Mahdi, the assassination of the founders, Abu Abdullah Shi and Abu Abbas, and a purge of the North African Dawah hierarchy. And you can see the listing that I have made here during al-Qaim's time, al-Mansur's time, al-Mu'azz's time, al-Aziz, al-Ḥākim, al-Zahir, al-Mustansir, and so on. And what I've done is I've color-coded, and my apologies to those of you who have color issues in vision. The green are intra-Ismaili events that are that we would not categorize as cosmopolitan. The orange is intra-Islamic fractures of what would be called cosmopolitan. And the red are inter-religious fractures, the persecution of Jews and of Christians. And then there are socio-political developments that I think are also indicative of the lack of a cosmopolitan milieu. So with that in mind, I ask, is it fair to say in what week, rhetorically of course, in what week the Fatimids were cosmopolitan? And I'm saying this not in a puerile fashion. I understand that there was a positive ethos. Dr. Jiva, you have written about the Aman of Yaḥyā as-Sakili. And there are real politic issues of imperiogenesis, and there are contestations that take place within and between religious traditions. But I'm suggesting here that this category is so prone for selective reading and the selective reading can go in multiple ways. And one of the problems with that is that if we negotiate this in the wrong way, it becomes a golden age syndrome. And that is a problem for rigorous scholarship. So I want to present a little case from Iran. This is the Seljuk recapture of Shahdiz, a fortress just outside of Isfahan. Isfahan was the administrative capital of the Seljuks. And this material comes, I take it from Rashiduddin Fazlullah's Jami' Tawarik, and it is also there in Kashani's Zubda Tawarik, but it is, interestingly enough, not found in Juvaini. And my understandings from my research are that much of the material in Hassan al-Sabbah's biography is drawn from Nizari sources, and this anecdote, this event, is actually from non-Nizari sources, Zahiruddin Nishapuri's History of the Seljuks and Ibn al-Athir's Tariq al-Kamil. And to me, that suggests that this was not included in the Sarguzasht Sayyidina, which Juvaini acquired at the fall of Alamut. So, talking about cosmopolitanism, there were relations between the Ismailis, the Nizaris, between the Seljuks. In the 1080s, we're told that Hassan al-Sabbah was tutor to Amir Yuruntash, who had the iqta of the region of Alamut. In the 1090s, Hassan al-Sabbah acquired Alamut, and this is where a fissure takes place in the relationships. Malik Shah and Nizam al-Mulk, his vizier, instigate several attacks on Alamut, and there's a number of counter-attacks, number of assassinations in return, and this history is something for another space. But Malik Shah was, Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated in 1092, Malik Shah dies some 30 days later, and there is a battle for who would become the Sultan. And his oldest son, Berkyaruk, becomes supreme between 1094 and 1104. And it is possible that as he was exiting Isfahan and yielding it to his brothers who were fighting him, Berkyaruk possibly abandoned the fortress of Shahdiz, a matter of 5 miles outside of Isfahan, to the Ismailis. In the late 90s, an Amir Dad Habshi, granted Gerd Khuh to Rais Muzaffar, and sometime later he fielded 5,000 Nizari soldiers on behalf of Berkyaruk. Rashiduddin reports, Berkyaruk dostar Rafikan budi wa akidat-e ishan ra munkar na. Berkyaruk was, he loved the Rafikan, the Ismailis, and he did not reject their belief. Does that suggest that he was more than well disposed? Perhaps he might have dallied with Ismailism. But on to our case study. In 1107, 3 years after Muhammad bin Malik Shah had established himself supreme, his brother had died 3 years earlier, a siege was raised. A siege was raised around the fortress of Shahdiz. There were various delays because people in the court had said, there's an attack coming here, there's an attack coming thither. Is that an infiltration by the Ismailis of the Seljuk hierarchy? Once the siege was put together in June of 1107, the ulama started calling the populace to join the soldiers, and the siege intensified because nothing could come out, nothing could leave. And at that point, the Ismailis who issued a fatwa, and they asked to be recognized as those who say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, as being a community amongst the Muslims, perhaps yielding their truth claims, exclusive truth claims. And the ulama gathered from Isfahan came to almost a consensus. Ijma was achieved almost, except for one alim who said that their blood is licit because according to him, since their imam had made permissible what the Sharia forbids. Malik Shah tried to avoid the battle. He issued an aman, a writ of protection, and the people from the fortress came down and they were allowed to go to Alamut. But the defenders of the fortress, including the son of the person who had converted or had introduced Hassan al-Sabah accepted Hassan al-Sabah into the Ismaili fold, Ahmed ibn Abdul Malik al-Atash and his defenders attacked the besiegers, and a massacre took place, and Ahmed was paraded around mockingly. He was skinned, beheaded, and his head was sent to Baghdad. In the text, this refers to the fatwa that was issued. When the situation intensified, they wrote a fatwa which said, what say the imams of the faith concerning the right of a group of people who differently believe in God, the Almighty, and in coming of the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabian, and know his books and prophets as true and righteous, who, however, with a faction that differs on the truth of the imam, is it permissible for the Sultan of the age to reconcile and make peace with them and accept their belief and to keep them from misfortunes and calamity? And the response was, the jurists who were present considered the permissibility meritorious. However, Abu Hassan Ali al-Simanjani, who was one of the greatest sheikhs of the Shafis, said, it is not permissible to accept them by virtue of their two testimonies. The imam who they adhere to has made what is forbidden by the Sharia lawful for them. So what do we learn from this? When the going gets tough, alliance is easy. Perkaruk and the Ismailis are a possible example of such an alliance. When familiarity and intimacy exist, there is no other. Amirdad Habashi was adopted by Rais Muzaffar, and he may even have adopted Ismailism in the process. When tensions ease, the thorn in the side can be removed, must perhaps be removed. Muhammad bin Malik Shah's siege of Shadis, a dominant position just 5 miles outside of the capital, required this. And he tried to avoid battle. In the Aman, he states, as long as this life remains in this body, I will be true to the oath. But the oath was broken. So the question is, why did Ahmed and Atash's forces persist in attacking the Seljuks, even when they were given an Aman? My question is, would they rather die than come under Hassan al-Sabah's authority? Does this open up doors and understandings of possible factionalism within the Ismailis? Is this why this episode is not mentioned in the chronicles and documents coming out of Alamut? Then the other question is, why was the Ijma swayed? It is impossible to wipe away centuries of negative stereotypes. And in times of conflict, it is always easy to fall back on that. And I put there, compare present-day racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, and Judeophobia. Let me now turn to, and this is going to be kind of hard without the transitions, but when I was studying with Michael Brett many, many moons ago, a lifetime ago, he was developing this notion of the three realms of the Fatimid, the realm of the Fatimid Imam, the realm of the Fatimid Dawa, and the realm of the Fatimid Dawla, which is kind of nicely represented on the coinage as well. And as almost all of you will know, the Fatimids divided the world in 12 Jazair. So we are looking at things from the perspective of the Jazair of the Iranians. And in this context, the Fatimid hierarchy around 1070s, I represent here from my text, the El-Khanid Chronicles, which are based off of the Nizari texts that were acquired out of Alamut before the libraries were burnt. The ranking is the Hujjah is the highest ranking official, and then the various gradations of the Dais and the believers, and then the communities of Muslims and non-Muslims. But Shi'i soteriology, the essential cornerstone, nay, the foundation is that whoever dies not having known the Imam of his time dies the death of the days of ignorance. This is in fact a hadith from the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So what does that mean? In the context of the Ismailis in Iran, I invoke Marshall Hodgson's Ayan Amir system as schematized by John Woods of Chicago, and I have developed that into a hierarchy paralleling that of the Hudud ad-Din. And my suggestion is that the Ismailis, both the Fatimids as well as the Nizaris, were aiming to do this. It would be nice if my animations were working, but effectively the Ayan Amir system was to be displaced by the Hudud ad-Din. And where does this go? Well, we have a terminus in the Nizari understanding of society after the Qiyamah. The Qaim is at the apex of this hierarchy, and the Hujjah would be next, or the Khalifa Allah, as the texts read. And this would be Rais Muzaffar in Muminabad and Rashiduddin Sinan, perhaps in Syria. But then the society of peoples is divided into three: the Ahli Wahdat, the true believers, the Ahli Taratub, the believers, and then the rest. So the Ahli Taratub are the damned. So there's a privileged class and then the rest. What do we learn from this? Did you notice that I was talking about 12th and 13th century Nizari Ismailis in Iran? Would they count by any stretch as part of the Fatimid cosmopolis? What about until 1171? Why are certain authors and events included in the category and others not? So I'm stretching this notion of what Fatimid means. Perhaps we should be thinking of it as a time, not just a dynasty, a time period. And I argue that at the heart of cosmopolitanism, the essential element is a moral equality of humans. No matter what our differences, there is that notion that we are all equal at some point. When a community with a religious truth has an exclusive or exercises an exclusive right to that, can there be cosmopolitanism? The Ismailis believed in salvation happens only through the Imam. So was there a thing such as Fatimid cosmopolitanism? Let me conclude with this. Diogenes did not want to self-incriminate. He had been cutting off bits of precious metal from the coinage back in Sinop. Claiming to be a cosmopolitus, he sought to hide his identity and crime from his interlocutor. I ask, what follies do we mean to hide in claiming our subjects of study or the group we affiliate with to be cosmopolitan? Is this presentist? Might we tell Alexander to get out of the light so that we can focus on interpreting the vectors of particularities and relations between individuals and groups, rather than totalize 260 years of time, space, lives, events, and past actualities into loose-fitting categories? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiraz. Lots to think about there, and certainly to respond to. We now have Stephen Geertz presenting to us, but despite all his efforts and ours, we haven't been able to get his video sorted. So he has his presentation ready, so we will hear him certainly, but we won't be able to see him. So bear with us, and over to you, Dr. Geertz.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jiwa. I do apologize for not getting my video up for you. The most important Melkite study on in 10th and 11th century Fatimid Palestine comes from the pen of Yaḥyā ibn Saʿīd al-Anṭākī, who wrote his Kitab Ta'arikh al-Adil, sequel history, in the early 11th century. Apparently as a continuation of the earlier historical work of Sayyid ibn Batrik. Yaḥyā's interests were wide-ranging. He included not only narrative about the Fatimid Empire and its Melkite subjects, but also historical accounts of the politics and the intrigues of the contemporary Byzantine Empire, and of the battleground between the Byzantines and their Muslim neighbors in Syria. Yaḥyā also describes some of the political and military developments in Abbasid Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. What concerns me, though, is his narrative as it relates to Fatimid Egypt and Palestine, particularly as it relates to the Melkite Christians living there. In this paper, I want to show that while Yaḥyā does not make a direct link between sectarianism and Muslim-Christian relations in his text, he nevertheless offers evidence of anti-Sunni sentiment among the Fatimid caliphs, directed not only at the far-off Abbasids, but also towards Sunnis inside the Fatimid realms. He gives us also a fuller picture of how Fatimid relations with Christian Byzantium impacted Christian dhimmis living under Fatimid rule. Moreover, he shows how, contrary to the notion that dhimmis were mere pawns in the hands of the caliphs, Christians could and did show agency in their dealings with the caliphs, as well as with fellow Muslim subjects. So I'm looking at three different caliphs. The first is al-Aziz Billah. One need not look far to find evidence of sectarianism influencing al-Aziz's actions as caliph. Yaḥyā writes in 979 that al-Aziz sent one of his officers, Fadl bin Saleh, to fight their enemies in Syria, but that the Turkish commander, al-ḥākim, succeeded in killing Fadl, whose body was then returned to Egypt. Upon hearing this, al-Aziz in 980 stopped the Qunut prayer, and it was the prayer Muslims make in the mosque during the month of Ramadan after prayer, that being the greatest prayer of all the Sunni Muslims. The Qunut was a prayer thought by many Sunnis to have been established by the Caliph Umar, and it's usually a supplication prayer offered during times of calamity. That al-Aziz would do this after a defeat suffered by one of his generals could indicate that he was angry over the opposition from Sunnis that the Fatimids were facing in Syria, and was then seeking to punish Sunnis living under his rule in Egypt. Yaḥyā also provides his readers with details about dhimmi relations with al-Aziz that are missing in al-Makrizi's account. He mentions, for example, that in the year 985, Aristos, the maternal uncle of the Sayyida, daughter of al-Aziz Billah, was appointed Patriarch of Jerusalem. In his commentary on this passage, Paul Walker writes that the Sayyida, i.e. Sit al-Mulk, was born in the Maghrib to al-Aziz and an Walid, and it's possible that she could have been Melkite. In any case, it appears that al-Aziz and his family had significant influence over and maintained good relations with the Melkite clergy in Palestine and Egypt. We also find Yaḥyā describing the service of the converted Jew Yaḥyā bin Kilis and the Christian Fadl bin Saleh in the highest levels of the Fatimid government. Yaḥyā relates an incident following a drought in the Nile Basin in 983, when al-Aziz arrested Yaḥyā and Fadl, confiscated their belongings and assets, and put them under house arrest for 2 months. It's not clear why he did this, but the context of the passage suggests that he may have held them responsible for the chaos in the markets that occurred following the drought. He quickly restored them to their positions, however. And when Yaḥyā later died, al-Aziz mourned him publicly and gave him great honor. Yaḥyā records that as a Jewish convert to Islam, Yaḥyā achieved great power and influence under al-Aziz. And while al-Aziz's mourning for Yaḥyā may be a trope, there's no reason to doubt that al-Aziz had great affection for his wazir. More importantly, it appears that al-Aziz deemed Yaḥyā's writing on Islamic law valuable enough to affix his own name to it, perhaps putting it on par with the fiqh of al-Qadi al-Numan, before it became clear that most legists would not agree to use it in their work. While Yaḥyā does not explain why this majority rejected Yaḥyā's fiqh, it's possible that Yaḥyā's Jewish background prejudiced them against it, and al-Aziz didn't wish to counter them in this. The incident then could suggest that Christian and Jewish officials, even when they converted to Islam and found favor with the caliph and his family, found it difficult to command the confidence of the Muslim elite. Yaḥyā includes one other relevant account relating to dhimmis in Egypt under al-Aziz. Al-Aziz appointed a Christian named Yaḥyā ibn Saʿīd as a supervisor of affairs, and then ordered him to construct a fleet to oppose the Byzantine army of Emperor Basil II. Ibn Saʿīd did this, and then resolved to dispatch the fleet in the year 996. But then a fire broke out and burned 16 ships. The people of Egypt accused Byzantine merchants and those some Jews from southern Italy of doing this, and they proceeded to plunder churches in Fusṭāṭ and attack clergymen. Yaḥyā mentions, and I quote, Ibn Saʿīd rode out, and he came down to Fusṭāṭ. He ordered them to stop their troublemaking concerning the Byzantines, and he forbade their resistance. It was proclaimed in the city that each one of the plunderers returned what he took, and some of that was returned. Of those Byzantines not killed, he brought forward and paid to each of them what was theirs. He then seized 63 of the plunderers, and they were arrested. Al-Aziz ordered the release of 1/3 of them, the beating of 1/3 of them, and the killing of 1/3 of them. He writes notes, some of which said, "You will be beaten, others you will be killed, and others you will be released." And they were put under a canvas, izar. Each one of them, the plunderers, came and took a note, and it was done according to what was written in it. This account offers us several insights into how dhimmis fared under the rule of al-Aziz. First, it demonstrates how al-Aziz entrusted high governmental offices to Christians, as he did with Yaḥyā ibn Saʿīd. It also shows how Christians who were not dhimmis, in this case, Byzantine merchants living in Fatimid, Egypt, but who were subjects of the Byzantine emperor, could make trouble for Christian dhimmis by burning ships in the fleet, commanded by a Christian dhimmi no less, which was intended to combat the Byzantines. As we've seen, this action then provoked angry Muslims associated with the palace to plunder various churches in and around Cairo and Fusṭāṭ. It also shows how Christian dhimmis and government could use their authority to clamp down on Muslim violence against Christians, and then receive the backing of the caliph for their actions. Al-Aziz took it upon himself to mete out justice to those Muslims who plundered the churches. His judgment to release 1/3 of the men, beat 1/3, and kill 1/3 suggests that Al-Aziz did not know who precisely was responsible for the plundering, and so he had the men draw lots as to what their punishment would be. What we find then is that Christian dhimmis under Fatimid rule had to negotiate not only their relationship with the caliph through the likes of Ibn Saʿīd, but also relations with Byzantine Christians living there, and with Muslims who resented the presence of those Byzantines. Okay, moving to al-Ḥākim bi-Amr Allah. Given how controversial al-Ḥākim's reign was, it should come as no surprise that Yaḥyā harbored some strong opinions and views concerning the caliph. Indeed, he was of the opinion that the caliph was mentally diseased, and that it was due to this disorder that the caliph pursued the extreme and contradictory policies that he did. This diagnosis of al-Ḥākim's condition has become the generally accepted consensus of historians, and the means by which many of the oddities and contradictions in his reign are explained. To be sure, al-Ḥākim's mental condition was extraordinary, and it's probably the case that this instability affected his decision-making at times. Yet even those historians who largely agree with Yaḥyā's diagnosis caution that not everything al-Ḥākim did should be attributed to his madness. Walker writes, for instance, that al-Ḥākim's condition does not fit, nor does it explain more than a tiny portion of his constant activity. He did not cease to run his government, nor to monitor the affairs of state, as far as we can tell. If anything, he increases his supervision of them, appointing new and in some ways more capable men to office, end quote. I'd like to suggest that there's indeed a rationale that undergirds the seemingly erratic policies of al-Ḥākim. That his policies were inconsistent reflects his changing postures of and towards Sunnis at various times during the Fatimid Caliphate. Rather than simply viewing al-Ḥākim as the mad caliph, whose reign was unrepresentative of the Fatimid Caliphate and even the Muslim caliphates in general, I think we might do better to consider how the shifting tides of the Sunni-Shia conflict impacted him and his fluctuating policies toward both Sunnis and dhimmis. Given that al-Ḥākim was not alone in this, al-Aziz's halting of the Qunut prayer proves this point. We should be cautious in accepting Yaḥyā's diagnosis at face value. Yaḥyā's testimony, Concerning al-Ḥākim is also valuable because of the details he provides of the caliph's last 7 years of his reign, from 1013 to 1021, after which al-Ḥākim disappeared. It's during this period that al-Ḥākim reversed many of his policies that were oppressive toward Dhimmi Christians and began to make reparations for the harm done earlier in his reign. Yaḥyā records that the first significant policy change that he made was in the year 1013. Upon learning that Christians fleeing his lands for Byzantium were spending large amounts of money to bribe guards, he gave them and Jews safe conduct, whereupon many left for Latakia, Antioch, and other Byzantine cities. The question is, of course, why al-Ḥākim treated these Christians as kindly as he did. Just previous to his discussion about al-Ḥākim's policy change regarding Christians fleeing to Byzantium, Yaḥyā mentions that al-Ḥākim, quote, enticed the people of the faraway places to pay him allegiance. Prayers were set for him in Kufa, and his da'wah reached the gates of Baghdad and the city of Rai. He gave a large sum of money to the governors and rebels in Iraq to gain their allegiance, end quote. Yet, as we know from al-Makrizi, in 1010, the Iraqi cities of Mosul, al-Anbar, Madain, and Kufa all reversed course and reaffirmed their oath to the Abbasid Caliph. That reversal surely came as a blow to al-Ḥākim. His decision to stop repressing Dhimmis late in his reign may be because doing so was not achieving the results among Sunnis in Egypt and the Sham for which he'd hoped. As it became clear that his attempt to convert Sunnis to his cause was not working, al-Ḥākim decided that his repressive policies toward Dhimmis were no longer needed, and so he began to ease them. This said, al-Ḥākim's failure to appeal to and appease Sunnis was probably not the only reason that the caliph changed his policy in regard to Dhimmis. Yaḥyā writes that during this period, al-Ḥākim developed a genuine friendship with Anba Salmun, the abbot of the Melkite monastery at Mount Sinai, today known as St. Catherine's. Notably, in 1020, the abbot requested and was able to secure al-Ḥākim's permission to restore the endowments that supported the monks of the Sinai. Some months later, he again approached the caliph and asked him to rebuild the Melkite monastery at Qusair, located near Fusṭāṭ in the Tura Hills south of Cairo, to permit the Christians to worship there and to return the monastery's endowments. Al-Ḥākim agreed to this. And he also canceled the land tax and promised the monastery tax, the monastery tax exemption as a sign of friendship. Anba Salmun then appealed for the return of the property of the Christians living in faraway districts, and al-Ḥākim granted every request except those in Damascus and districts along the Mediterranean coast, as the government had already spent the revenue due to financial difficulties. Then, upon Anba Salmun's informing al-Ḥākim that the populace was still fearful of him, the caliph wrote another proclamation, swearing by the Prophet and Ali ibn Abi Talib, and assured the Christian community of Egypt that he would protect them, their children, wealth, properties, and that no harm would come to them. Muslims then became angry with al-Ḥākim for his friendship with Anba Salmun, accusing him that he did not deny any of the abbot's requests, and saw in this an indication that he'd become a disciple of Anba Salmun. It was soon after this that al-Ḥākim disappeared while on his way to visit the monastery of Al-Qusair during his reconstruction efforts, while his earlier rule suggests that the caliph perceived these Christians to be a threat at worst and a liability at best. At the end of his life, al-Ḥākim no longer seemed to have any qualms about them, and indeed openly associated with and supported them. Okay, we come to the third and last caliph here. Al-Zahir. Al-Ḥākim's change of heart near the end of his reign did not resolve all of the problems Christian Dhimmis had faced during the earlier part of his caliphate. Yaḥyā records that early in al-Zahir's reign, both Christian and Jewish Dhimmis approached the new caliph with a complaint that they were being forced to observe Islamic law, and they expressed their anger over this, arguing that the Quran affirmed that there was to be no compulsion in religion. They asked that they be permitted to remove themselves from such legal restrictions and be given the protection due them as dhimmis. Those who wish to convert to Islam voluntarily and from the heart should be permitted to do so, provided that their goal was not for worldly reasons. Those who wanted to stay in their religion without apostatizing should be protected, and the people of the millah, i.e. the Christian community living under Muslim rule, should accordingly be guarded and preserved. If by the end of his reign, al-Ḥākim had begun to reverse some of his earlier policies that targeted and punished dhimmis, Al-Zahir appeared to have gone even further into helping restore their position to what it had been during the time of al-Aziz. Yaḥyā writes that the Christians went back to publicly celebrating their feast days and Easter processions that were on the outskirts of the city of Cairo. He also notes that al-Zahir was present to witness their gatherings and to guard them, an observation that accords with those of al-Makrizi. He also lightened their giyar, and many of them were required only to wear the zunar and a black imama. And he permitted them the building of churches and returned to them endowments that had not been disposed of already by al-Ḥākim. Al-Zahir also allowed Christians who converted to Islam under duress during the reign of al-Ḥākim to return to Christianity. Yaḥyā mentions the curious case of a group of Christians who had fled to and then returned from the lands of Byzantium. At some point, they converted to Islam, but then they publicly observed Christianity. Quote, no one opposed them, and it, i.e. the jizya, was taken from them. Yaḥyā adds that this was also the case with Egyptian Christians who returned, quote unquote, to Christianity from Islam, and that the jizya was taken for the year in which it stopped being collected from them to the year in which each of them reverted to Christianity. In other words, al-Zahir did not accept the conversion to Islam of these Christians, i.e. of either the Christians who fled to Byzantine lands or those who stayed under the Fatimids. He insisted that the jizya be charged retroactively for the period in which they had been publicly living as Muslims, but privately holding Christian convictions. Let's finish our study by examining Fatimid-Byzantine relations during the Caliphate of al-Zahir. Like al-Makrizi, Yaḥyā also describes how the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem became a bargaining chip in relations between the two powers. First, he relates how in the year 415, the Sayyida, i.e. Sit al-Mulk, attempted to negotiate with Byzantium by sending Nicephorus, Patriarch of Jerusalem, to demonstrate to the emperor how well the Fatimid Caliphate was treating its dhimmis. She instructed the Patriarch to, quote, highlight the return of the churches, the restoration of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the rest of the churches in the lands of Egypt and Syria, the return of endowments to it, i.e. the church, and the soundness of the affairs of the Christians who were under their possession, guard, and maintenance, end quote. In return, the Sayyida asked that commerce be released from Byzantium to their lands, and that those who come from the lands of Islam to their districts be received. As a leading member of the Caliphal family, Sit al-Mulk was trying to use Fatimid tolerance of dhimmis as a tool to increase trade between the Byzantines and the Fatimids, a strategy that failed when she died before the emperor could respond to her offer via the Patriarch. So what then does our reading of Yaḥyā add to our understanding of dhimmi relations with the Fatimids? First, it suggests that the Fatimid caliphs were indeed impacted by sectarianism and motivated to counter other Muslim sects in their policies. Al-Ḥākim was not unique in pursuing punitive measures towards Sunnis within his realm. As noted, Yaḥyā observes that al-Aziz stopped the Qunut prayer, thought to have been established by Umar, and he did this shortly after a defeat the Fatimids suffered on the Palestinian frontier. Second, it gives us a fuller picture of how Fatimid relations with Christian Byzantium impacted Christian dhimmis living under Fatimid rule. Yaḥyā's account shows that it was not only the Byzantine nobility who can make consequential decisions, but also Byzantine merchants living in Fatimid domains, assuming, of course, that these merchants truly did torch boats in Egypt's fleet. Yet, the concern for good relations with Byzantium could also translate into pressure on the caliphs to treat their Christian subjects well, as evidenced by Sit al-Mulk's attempt to persuade the Byzantines to sign a trade agreement with them and return Muslims captured and enslaved by Constantinople. Finally, Yaḥyā's account reminds us that contrary to the notion that dhimmis were mere pawns in the hands of the caliphs, they could and did show agency in their dealings with the caliphs as well as with fellow Muslim subjects. Isa ibn Nasturus stepped in to stop Muslims from destroying and pillaging churches in Egypt, following the allegation that Byzantine merchants had torch boats in the navy. And Anba Samun took the initiative to approach al-Ḥākim to restore the endowments of monasteries, despite the punitive policies that the caliph had pursued toward dhimmis earlier in his reign. That Christians showed agency does not negate the argument that they were caught in and impacted by the Sunni-Shia conflict, but it does complicate the picture, reminding us that the caliphs were responding not only to intra-religious conflict, but to the actions of dhimmis as well. All right, thanks very much.